I would never in my life share this story were I not forced to do so. I've never told anyone. Only 2 living people know the truth, but I've been forced into a corner and I need advice. If you'd like to try turning me into the police for the events recounted in this post, then feel free, but know that this account is carefully maintained as to be untraceable to my true identity. You may think it's impossible. Nothing on the internet is anonymous, but I assure you, it is not only possible, but easy. If you know who to ask. If, however, you have a sound moral compass and can acknowledge that law does not always equal righteousness, please give me advice. Anything at this point is welcome. I still remember that night like it was just past, although it happened years ago. I was tortured with nightmares on a regular basis, at least 5 times a week throughout the past month. My son, who had heard me screaming at night from his room down the hall, kept asking what was wrong. I didn't know how to tell him. Now, however, I worry that the metaphorical bullseye that was on my chest is on his. I'm getting ahead of myself. I told you I was having nightmares about the event that other night, and I was. So many times a week I believe I can recount them to you in relatively sound detail. It went something like this. My truck chases its headlights down the highway as I watch the car in front of me. I barely blink, intent on keeping track of the Honda. Nothing matters except the car in front of me, my target. Within my car and it, there are only 2 types of people, victim and survivor. It's yet to be determined who fits into what category. The car switches lanes, so do I, but a moment later. I can't lose this car, but I also can't let on that I'm following it. The man driving in front of me has a good reason to be wary. I've been watching for quite a while, learning the ins and outs of his travels, and by now I suspect his wind is up. I have no good reason to believe so, but I've relied on my intuition for much of my life. As soon as I realized doing otherwise was nonsensical and often dangerous, I made it a regular practice, and my gut's telling me he's spooked, like a hunted animal. With any luck, he'll disregard that little voice warning him that something is off. I have a feeling he's too comfortable, too arrogant to listen to it, but I can't bank on it. So extra care is key. The car exits the highway and turns onto a narrow dirt road. I stop at the gas station just before the turnoff. Now I know where he's headed, so there's no need to follow closely and give myself away. Let him have time to get settled in and cozy. Let his guard go down. I go inside to buy a cup of coffee, black as murder, and the clerk looks at me like I'm insane. Buying coffee at 11 at night. I just hand him my cash, make my way back outside without waiting for my change. My watch says it's 11:05. When did the Honda turn? About 5 minutes ago? Are the driver and his traveling companion in the cabin in the woods yet? Probably. Will they be prepared for my appearance? Only time will tell. But I don't think so. At 11:08, I get back in my truck and start the engine. I pull out of the stop and go, then flick my blinker on and turn down the same path the Accord took. The darkness of trees engulfs me, as if shielding the world outside of the woods from the carnage about to take place. I park about a half a mile from the cabin to avoid detection. I lift up the tarp in the back of my truck and peruse the tools there. I run my hands over a saw. No, sawing his throat open seems a bit too much trouble, too messy. A drill, maybe. No, somehow that's not right either. I heft each weapon, test its weight in my hand and how it feels in my grip until I reach a pair of hedge clippers. The feeling in my gut warms up. This is it. After I stick a handgun and a can of starter fluid in my pocket for insurance, and slide the set of hedge clippers into my waistband, I jog to the cabin, breathing the sharp, freezing air and feeling my heart do the jitterbug in my chest. Alright, so the coffee was a mistake. At least now I know better, although it does me little good in my current situation. I walk to the back of the cabin and find the wires attaching the place to various amenities. I cut the phone line with the clippers. Now we're effectively alone. I walk back around to the front of the cabin, hands shaking, and peer through the window at the scene inside. A feeble fire flickers in the grate, about to go out. A portly man crouches in front of it, trying to build it with matches and twigs. A boy sits in the armchair in the corner of the room, watching the man stoke the fire. He's an absolutely beautiful boy, beautiful enough to take my breath away. A head of hair as fiery red as a phoenix feathers, tussling and untidy, fair skin unmarred by scars of acne, but doused with a spray of freckles across the bridge of the nose, wide amber eyes, shining in the meek light of the excuse of a fire on the other side of the room. And now seeing the boy, all I can think about is seeing his beauty up close. My heart swells in my chest, my blood runs hot, and this is why I'm here. This boy. And I'll kill anyone who stands in my way. The man at the fire, Jamie is his name, turns and smiles. He speaks, and although his voice is muffled through the glass, I can still hear what he's saying. Why don't you go upstairs, Robin? There's a heater in the bedroom. And close the door. I don't want the warmth getting out. Can't have you catching a cold. The boy rises and drags his feet up the stairs. His face is long as Tolstoy's War and Peace as he disappears into the second floor. I step towards the door and knock. Rap, rap. As I hear the man rise with a grunt and a creak of floorboards, I stick my hand in my pocket and wrap my fingers around the pistol. I doubt I'll need it, but still, just in case. Steps towards the door. Clump, 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 clump. Sound of a door too comfortable, and its frame shifting as he turns the doorknob, a pair of wide eyes staring at me as I analyze his face, and then I smile. He tries to shut me out, but I stick my foot between the door and the door frame. Hello, Jamie. Do you know who I am? When it becomes clear that he can't overpower me, the idiot actually backs up, allowing me to open the door and step into the warmth of the cabin. Of course I know who you are. I'm calling the police. He runs to the phone and puts the receiver to his ear, and I laugh. Go ahead, try it. See what good it does you. Puts the phone down. He's heard the silence that signifies a deadline. You're not supposed to be here. You don't have custody of Robin. Lisa and I do. Yeah. Well, I'm here anyway. Tell Lisa to stick the courts on me. That is if you live, which is unlikely. I don't care. I step towards him. He backs away again, but he's almost against the wall. There's no escape. A rush of hatred hits me for this little rat of a man, as thick and consuming as a mudslide. I let go of the handgun in my pocket and instead reach for the hedge clippers that I tucked into my waistband, relishing the surety of the handle's rubber grip against my palm. A handgun's too quick for the likes of him. I won't let him. I want him to suffer, and we have all the time in the world. No one's coming to his rescue, and he certainly isn't leaving. I snip the clippers in my hand and smile as Jamie begins to scream. Schnick, schnick, a lovely sound. Don't. I swear I'll... You what? He doesn't answer, and I position the clippers against his large stomach. You'll what? Ralph, please. You brought this on yourself, you sick bastard. Schnick, schnick, like cutting paper. Except for the blood. Once he's on the floor, I turn him over to hide his destroyed abdomen, toss the clippers on top of his body, and look up the staircase. The boy, Robin, is peering down to the first floor from around the corner. I strip off my bloodstained jacket, my favorite hoodie. What a shame. Come here. Staring at me with wide eyes, he creeps down the stairs like a scared animal. I wipe my hands on my ruined sweatshirt, then cup his cheeks. It's all right. It's all right. It's over. His golden eyes, so much like his mother's, filled with tears. Is it? I smile. Yeah. Robin, it's over. I promise. I don't... He hiccups, then stops speaking, seemingly at a loss for words. Don't what? Don't believe it? He nods, his cheeks wet. Look. I turn him towards the body lying several feet to his right. He's gone. And we're about to burn this place down with him inside, so nobody has to know about a thing. Go outside, wait a few feet away from the house. I'll be there in a minute. He exits the house, wiping his tears with the heels of his hand. I put the can of starter fluid from my pocket and I spread the contents around the room, especially over Jamie. Then I make a trail right to the fire. I'm barely out of the house before the flames whoosh into life, bringing the light and warmth into cold, dark night. We walk to the truck. Robin's so tired he's stumbling, and he needs me to guide him with a hand on his back. When we reach the vehicle, he climbs in like a warm, torn soldier, slumping onto his seat and closing his eyes. As I start the engine, he asks, "Dad?" "Yes." "How did you know?" "Know what?" "How did you know that He can't bring himself to say that he's been molested on multiple occasions in that cabin. But that's okay. I already know. That gut feeling. In me, it's so strong it's almost more of a supernatural power, a true sixth sense, than that typical intuition. Once I leaned in to listen to it, I could never be fooled again, and that included every time I saw my son and he told me that he was fine when he wasn't. I pulled him to me and I hugged him close, winked tears away. "Don't worry about it, honey. Just close your eyes. Just go to sleep." 5 minutes after we start driving, he's snoring. Thus, the first portions of my nightmare went. They were, in case you were wondering, about events that took place. My ex-wife, the Lisa mentioned above, is a part of my dreams, married a pedophile who molested my son on multiple occasions, and after I found out, I killed him. Before anyone asks, no, I didn't go to the law because I've been in considerable legal trouble in the past, and I know the police wouldn't have done a damn thing to stop him. Killing him seemed the safest route, and so far it's proven to be. His disappearance was chalked up to a running off with a younger woman. Lisa always assumed Robin had gone with Jamie and had never brought his disappearance to the authorities. She never wanted the child anyway. Robin had been an accident, and she had never cared for him, only taking custody of him to spite me, and Robin and I have lived quiet lives together in a small town. Quiet at least until my nightmares began a month ago. I've recounted the first portion of my dreams to you, and while some of you, maybe even the majority of you, may believe the reliving of those events is enough to terrify me, it isn't. I'm not sorry for what I did to Jamie, because he had it coming. It was the second part of those nightmares that froze my heart in my chest. I wake up from the dream of Jamie's death, thanking God that my son is safe and sound. However, the smile dies on my lips before it has the opportunity to blossom. Something's wrong. The smell of blood and smoke pervades the room. I sit up in bed, my heart beating. It's pulsing in my throat. God forbid there's a fire in the house. I swing my legs out of bed to go check on the house for a fire, and a charred hand latches onto my ankle. It's blistering hot, but it's not why I scream. I scream because the thing pulling itself out from under my bed behind the hand, its leering, empty grin, its smoking skin, even in its destroyed state, I know that face. "Oh, Ralph. Do you know who I am?" "God, I do. I yank my ankle from its grip and run, but he grabs it again, and I trip and I fall in my frenzy. He towers over me, so weak in life, yet strong after death, his burning hands descending onto my throat. At that point, I always wake up, sweating and in shambles. The first time I had the nightmare, I assumed it was a random flare-up of guilt years late. I thought maybe I had repressed the emotions and was only feeling it now because I couldn't help but gush out. I walked out into the kitchen and intended to pour myself a glass of bourbon to calm my nerves, and I caught sight of a pair of bloody hedge clippers on the countertop. My blood frozen, I walk over and I pick them up. They were warm, and the handles had singe marks on them. I was concerned then that it was more than just repressed guilt causing me nightmares. I threw them out before Ralph stumbled upon them, but their message stayed with me. Furthermore, that message was reinforced throughout the months that I had nightmares by way of other signs: the smell of smoke, thick and noxious, at random points in the house, a constant feeling of being watched wherever I went, but especially when I was with Robin. As if something was jealous. I did my best to shrug it off, but at night, after Robin was in bed, I always feared sleep. For a month I endured those nightmares without a clue of what they meant, except that they meant nothing good. They could have meant my death at the hands of Jamie's angry spirit. They could have meant my prevention of the sleeping soundly for the rest of my life. They could have been an omen of my secret getting out. Whatever the case, I had no idea what to do and didn't plan on taking action. My last nightmare, which happened 3 days ago, was different from the others, and it persuaded me to do otherwise. All followed the script that had been established. The remembrance of the incident in question, the fake awakening, Jamie's hand clamping down on my ankle. This time, however, rather than closing the grip around my throat, Jamie just hovered over me, smiling, smirking. I could feel the heat from his body baking me, drying out my eyes, and finally he said, "I want that boy. I want that boy. And I'll have him." Jamie's been very tired lately. I wake up sometimes at night to him screaming. When I ask him what's wrong, he just says he's not sleeping well. Having nightmares. When I ask him what about, he won't answer, but that intuition of mine. That intuition of mine knows what he's not telling me. My own safety becoming questionable wasn't enough to spur me to action. Robin's safety coming into question, however. I've killed to keep that boy safe once, and I'll do whatever it takes to keep him safe again. Any suggestions on how to defeat a vengeful spirit would be greatly appreciated. I have to post this story everywhere I can. If enough people see it, maybe a few of you will understand what's happened to me. That's all I need. Someone has to understand. The shoes were on my couch this morning, pressing into the cushion like there was a whole person's weight on them. I'd burn them, but I don't want to get close. When I called my friends about it, they just laughed at me. Like I'm trying to string them along with some stupid joke. They're too busy to come over anyway, since it's so close to finals week. And that leaves me alone with these shoes. Here's what happened. The whole process. I should write it down so that maybe some people out there might see the logic in it. Maybe there's a chance that some of you have heard about it before, but please don't attempt to do this yourself. It's terrible, and it's real, and I just want people to understand what I'm going through. Last semester, a guy in my theology class was talking about some pagan traditions, power words, and special witch recipes and stuff of that sort. He knew a lot on account of it being the subject of his term paper, but he told me that he knew even more that he'd done some extra research in an archive at the city library. He found records of a ritual that supposedly hadn't been put in practice since the 1600s. And he told me the steps. This brings me back to the shoes. They had to be 11 inches in length, about the length of most size 11 men's shoes. The type of shoe didn't matter as far as he knew. They were to be placed on a basement floor at least 1 story underground, with the heels together and the toes pointed somewhere about 30 degrees apart. I really don't get why any of these details mattered. Maybe some of you guys out there will understand it better. Still, I did exactly as the rules said. I just wanted to see if anything might happen. I even snapped a picture of the shoes on my phone, just in case. Hopefully you guys can see it here. There was one other item I had to bring, a large pitcher full of dirt. I took it from my backyard and I brought it downstairs with me, feeling stupid for going through with this. After placing the shoes, I spread the dirt around them in a thick circle. Exactly how thick wasn't specified, so I just made it about a few inches around on all sides. As I spread the dirt, I repeated this sort of chant that the guy had told me. Wake up, Mr. Strider. Wake up, Mr. Strider. And for the life of me, I can't think of a single person with the name Strider. It's a weird name, but I said it anyway. So then, after putting down all the dirt, I sat with my back to the circle like he told me to. There couldn't be any lights on, he said, except fire. And I wasn't about to smoke up my basement with a bunch of burning logs, so all I had were a few candles. I don't know why I went through with this. I didn't even know that guy very well, and now I'm freaking out. They were on my couch this morning. Okay, here are the next steps I took. I waited in the dark for what might have been about 5 minutes, but I'm not sure. That's the point. The guy told me that I had to wait until I began losing my sense of time. That's when the magic can happen. So he said. If you hear noise or feel movement, the rule is to hold your breath for at least 10 seconds. If you hold your breath long enough to leave the room and walk upstairs, then you can end the ritual. I didn't feel or hear anything at the time, so I sat there. I just kept waiting. Once the time passed, there was only a few more steps. I asked, "Are you awake, Mr. Strider?" And I paused for a few seconds after, and then I looked over my shoulder. The guy said that if the dirt looked like it was moved, I was supposed to turn back away as fast as I could and hold my breath. He didn't say that there might be a pair of legs attached to the shoes, which is exactly what I saw. The legs were not human. They were deformed and slick from some sort of fluid. The skin was gray with what looked like pieces of bone poking out. It makes me nauseous. Just remembering what little I saw, I forgot to hold my breath. I just ran upstairs and shut the door, and I swear I heard another set of steps following me. Maybe I should have called the police right there and then, that instant. It was just so dark down there that I convinced myself I was imagining stuff in the shadows. And I know I wasn't imagining it. I should have gotten up and gotten help from the start. I came home last night, and after turning off the kitchen light when I was done making dinner, I saw them. I saw them in the doorway. Until that moment, I convinced myself that I was just being stupid. That's when I knew I was fucking cursed. Something's inhabiting those shoes, and I don't have a damn clue how to stop it. I'm too scared to get close. Even when I don't see them, I can hear movements sometimes, steps that sound heavier than mine. It doesn't seem to care whether it's dark anymore. The light was streaming in through the windows this morning, and it was just waiting for me. Planted on the couch. It's been implants on the carpeting in weird places, the kind that come from when someone really heavy has sat in one spot for a long time. I don't want to sleep here tonight. I'm scared. I'm scared that I'll wake up to this thing pressing down on my chest. It could break right through my ribs and fucking crush me. I don't really know. My best bet is to relocate, probably, but it's not like this thing is confined to my house. I don't even have a clue where it'll show up next. It could appear at my neighbor's backyard door if it wanted to, or at my friend's. If anyone reading this knows what exactly I've done, then please tell me. I know that I've made a mistake, but if there's a way to stop this thing, then I have to find out. I need help. There's one more thing that I have to say to all of you. Do not try this yourself, ever. The entity that's attached to this ritual, or whatever, this Mr. Strider thing, whatever the fuck it is, it's not here out of goodwill. It's malignant and persistent and terrifying. I only saw a part of it for an instant, but even if that glimpse of its legs was enough to know, I had a reason to fear it. I never told anyone of the nightmare which saved me from the Holocaust. My name is Abner Schulman, and I am a 94-year-old Holocaust survivor. I was a teenager when the Germans arrived in my village. That was the day my entire world ended. It was Armageddon. In the very sense of the word. The non-Jewish villagers helped the invading Nazis to round us up. They had hated us long before they had even heard of Adolf Hitler. Anyone deemed fit to work was thrown into a cramped, freezing rail car and taken to one of the concentration camps, which is where my story takes place. What I believed happened in June of 1944 may have been a figment of my imagination, a grand hallucination, desperate attempts of a broken man to piece together some kind of meaning amidst pure, unbridled horror and tragedy. I was starving, sleep-deprived, and overcome with grief at the loss of my family and friends, so I'm not about to claim that I maintained a stable mind. Many of my fellow prisoners suffered madness during that time, claiming to have seen and heard all kinds of things during their imprisonment. But as I sit here, in the twilight of my life, I feel I must relate things that felt as real to me then as writing this does now. The summer of 1944 was a scorching one. My labor gang was given the back-breaking task of digging a canal from the nearby river to the camp itself, all in the sweltering midday heat. We were barely fed, rarely watered, and the SS guards only passing out canteens of lukewarm, unfiltered water when men had begun to vomit and pass out from the heat stroke. I remember the hunger like it was yesterday, the retching, twisting pain that lived with you on a daily basis. All you could ever think of was to get something to eat. At night, we would dream of feasts, surrounded by family and friends that we would never see again. One afternoon, as the sun was perched high in the cloudless blue sky, one of our fellow prisoners suddenly stopped working. He stared off into the distance, silently staring into shimmering haze. An SS guard cursed at him, racking a bullet into the chamber of his rifle. The prisoner snapped. His pupils dilated, froth foamed at the corners of his mouth as he commenced to rant and rave. We tried to calm him down, but it proved impossible. The man was rabid, wide-eyed. He had completely lost his mind. At first, the black-uniformed SS guard just laughed, mimicking him in Russian. This only infuriated the madman as he turned and glared at his detractors, trembling with frenzied rage. He growled, drool spilling from his lips as it leaked around his swollen tongue. "Revenge," he screamed. "Revenge is near." Over and over at the guards, laughing as he did so, the maniacal, haunting laugh of a doomed man who had nothing left to give. The guards stopped laughing as they began to comprehend his broken German. They looked at each other nervously as their mockery ceased, but as he continued his tirade, they started to look downright frightened. It didn't take long before one of the guards took out his sidearm and aimed it squarely at the madman's face, and fired a shot. The man collapsed into the canal, blood squirting from the small, rough hole torn through his forehead. We were ordered to dig his grave. The guards hissed, spitting on the body of the dead lunatic, the lunatic whose face was still etched with a feverish smile, even in death. It began the next day. Something was wrong with the river. Something terribly wrong. Much to our relief, all work on the canal was suspended until the situation could be resolved. Information was like a currency in those days. When you have nothing, something as simple as news becomes as valuable as gold. Scrambling for what little we could glean, we finally secured an audience with a member of a working party that had seen the condition of the nearby watercourse. "It's the heat," the man related. "The heat's reduced the amount of water, making the river muddy and slow. The guard says nothing can be transported using it until the weather has cooled and we get some rain." A heated argument broke out between the man explaining and another of the labor gang. "Yes, the color's changed, but it's just clay. Clay is dissolving into the river. That's what changes the color." He was an educated man. Many of us were. "Have you ever seen a river that color, Isaac?" The other man argued. "No, and neither have I. The river ran red. Red, Isaac. Red with the blood of our Hebrew brothers and sisters." The educated man tried to argue back. We were finished listening. We had escaped the filthy, sweaty work of ditch digging. For now. The next morning, as the blazing sun rose over cramped wooden barracks, I awoke to a noise that I hadn't heard since my childhood. The gentle, steady rhythm of a croaking frog floating through row after row of comfortless wooden bunks. It was just one at first, the faintest of noises, almost relaxing. It was shortly joined by others, many, many others. Soon hundreds of small, olive-green amphibians were hopping through the camp. I'd never seen anything quite like it. "They're escaping the dried-up river," one of the prisoners cried, "looking for another body of water." We were soon tasked with clearing out the camp, even given a few shovels to bash the small creatures before heaping their broken bodies into waiting wheelbarrows. It was grim work, but it'd be digging the canal. Yet as much as we tried, we were unable to stem the tide of frogs, those that hopped towards us from the dying river. Those that weren't crushed by the swings of our shovels died in the scorching heat of the June sun, dehydrated and slow. They expired where they lay. To our disgust, the lack of frogs in the nearby river meant that the insect population went unchecked, not to mention that the masses of amphibian carcasses that littered the camp attracted all kinds of maggots and swarming, carrion-hungry flies. A particularly aggressive variety of horsefly also invaded the camp at this point, giving the guards a rather rough time indeed. Some of the nastier bites grew inflamed and infected, leaking pale yellow pus and blood where they burst around exposed flesh. Much to our delight, some of the more spiteful guards were hospitalized in rather serious conditions. Yet there was something disconcerting about the selectivity of the biting insects, something that was overlooked in our joy that certain hated guards were suffering. Very few of the affected men were camp prisoners. Yeah, I saw one of the two men who had been bitten, some rather badly, but to my knowledge, not one of them suffered an infection or any kind of medical complication arising from an insect bite. A week later, the Russian artillery started. The booming explosions of distant shells grew closer as Russian forces began to take back our country. Inch by inch, we hoped that the Red Army would liberate us. The camp guards remained defiant in the face of their annihilation. Russian dogs, they would joke. Any day now, they'll run out of bodies to throw at us, then we'll turn the tide again. Moscow will be ours by next summer. You just wait. That night, we were awoken by a huge crashing noise that sent the camp guards into high alert. They were terrified that the Russians were attacking. We prayed that they were. However, it eventually became apparent that a German light bomber was attempting to return to a nearby airfield after being hit by anti-aircraft fire. It broke up in the skies over the camp, sending debris plummeting to earth. A section of wing sliced into the guards' barracks, killing several of them. At dawn, we were tasked with clearing up the mess left by the falling aircraft. As we worked picking up pieces of pulverized flesh, bone, and clothed uniform, the skies darkened, and rain finally broke. It was relief beyond words. Prisoners celebrated under the downpour, chastised by guards that still mourned the accidental death of their comrades. The deluge washed away weeks of sweat and grime, purifying us. For a brief moment, we felt free again. Then that afternoon, as the temperatures plummeted and the unusual chill danced in the air, a dense fog rolled in. It was the most impenetrable mist I've ever seen, before or since. You could barely see a couple of meters in front of you. The entire camp was plunged into near darkness, so completely consumed by the fog that we were confined to our barracks for the remainder of the working day. The mist still clung to the camp where we lay our heads down to sleep. Usually I would fall asleep after peering out of a small gap in the wooden slats of our barracks. I would watch the handful of guards patrolling with their electric torches, inspecting the structures with rifles slung over their shoulders. I tried to memorize their faces, every little feature, just in case there would ever be a day when these men would answer for their crime. But that night I saw something that still creeps into my mind on the darkest of nights, keeping me awake. Something I've never actually cared to rationalize. A figure walking among the barracks, one that didn't wear a uniform or carry a rifle. Due to the fog, they were hard to distinguish, and at first I thought it was an escaped prisoner. I made out ragged clothes and pale complexions that seemed sickly in the dim moonlight, but something was wrong with the way the figure moved. It walked lightly, almost weightlessly, an unnatural stillness to its gait. I still fell asleep, wondering just who I had been looking at. The following day was our last in the camp. We awoke to a panic. Still locked in our barracks, we peered through the small gaps in the wooden walls as camp guards rushed around in a frenzy. They looked panicked, eyes wide with shock and terror. There seemed to be even less of them than usual. "There's been an accident," one man exclaimed. "Something about the guards. Something happened during the night." One guard was openly weeping, sobbing over his oldest brother who also happened to be a guard at the same camp. Other men in black uniforms tried to console him, telling him that passing away whilst asleep is the most peaceful way to go. The surviving SS guards were tense. They were under strength now. There were many, many of us, and very few of them. We sensed it before they even gave the orders. We could feel the atmosphere of terror that gripped the few that remained. We were to be liquidated. We began to break our way out of our wooden prison as the guards began to empty their machine guns into the first barracks, massacring a large number of trapped prisoners. Men threw themselves into the barred doors 2 or 3 at a time as the rest of us watched in horror as the enraged SS men that set fire to the bullet-riddled building before moving on to the next. "Come on, Abner, throw your damn weight into it. Break it open for the love of God." "You try then, old man. Use your own damn body. The door would break you." The guards were shooting the second locked barracks now, screaming and cursing as they did. They were relishing in the slaughter, smiling and laughing as they murdered us. Just as the door in our barracks was beginning to give way, we noticed the door of another burst open. The occupants spilled out into the grim, gray light of the foggy morning. They rushed the firing guards, vengeance in their eyes, not caring that they were shot to pieces as they charged. The door finally tore from its hinges in front of me, letting in the smell of blood in the air. I was weak, starving. I didn't know where I summoned the strength to do so, but I ran. I was not alone either. Throngs of prisoners were running with me, pulling at the barbed wire fences, kicking the posts, and creating little escape routes for themselves. Some were hit by stray bullets as they tried to flee, collapsing into the mud or hanging on the razor-sharp wire like twisted marionettes. I could hear the gunfire as we reached the nearby tree line and disappeared into the woods. After the war, I took a boat to America. Looking up at the Statue of Liberty as our boat approached New York Harbor, I was surprised that I didn't feel the jubilation that I expected to. Guilt. It was guilt that weighed down my happiness that day, wondering why it was that I should survive, why so many of us met their ends in the dark, dingy death camps of the Nazis. I've since moved to Illinois, where so many others who understand what I've been through have also chosen to make their home. They've married, had children, watched them grow up, and have children of their own. Surrounded myself with love. But I'm sad to say this has not restored my faith in humanity. Well, that part of me died in the 40s, was never resurrected, but there's another kind of faith that I've not lost, one that's much harder for me to explain fully. Since the war, religion has not come easy to me. I try to keep kosher, however. God is going to have to explain to me why He forbid us to eat shrimp while it's making them so delicious. I don't observe a lot of our more obscure holidays, but I always celebrate Passover. Every year, I remember the spirit of death that passed over Egypt, reaping a terrible vengeance on the people that kept my people slaves for so long. I may have lost faith in mankind, but I've never lost faith in the power of avenging angels. It was Tuesday when I arrived in my cubicle. As I had done nearly every workday for the past 7 years, I hung my satchel over the chair, booted up my PC, and slumped into my station. The air was filled with recirculated coffee grinds and old paper with a hint of chemical cleaner. I moved my hands to the keyboard and almost knocked off a small, silver flip phone sitting upon it. I paused, brow furrowed slightly in confusion. That wasn't my cell phone. I picked it up, turned it around. It looked worn, perhaps one of my colleagues. Standing, I leaned over the partition to Carol's cube. "Carol, is this your cell phone?" Blonde blinked through her thick-rimmed glasses and shook her head. "No. What brand is it? I haven't seen it before." I examined it again and frowned. There was no company logo, not even when I flipped it open. It was off, so I thumbed the power button and it turned on with a quick little MIDI tune. The window displayed a dark wallpaper and a large red eye staring out, and the date and time displayed in white underneath. "Someone has weird taste," I quipped, showing Carol the display. She pulled a face. "It's like it can see me." I laughed at her, but I quickly realized she was looking a little pale. "Oh, it's nothing," I dismissed. I tried to access the menu. Perhaps some of the context would be familiar. But when I pushed the menu button, nothing happened. I tried the numbers. Still nothing. "Looks like the pad's busted," I muttered. Just then an eerie tune started to play from it. Something that set the hair on the back of my neck on end. I hesitated and then pushed the little green button, lifting the phone to my ear. "Stay away from her." The deep male voice almost made me drop the cell. It was horrible. Like no human male voice should ever be, so deep and mutilated. It was like I could hear the oozing of worms coiled around his vocal cords. "Leave my daughter alone." Then the signal cut out and I slammed the phone down upon my desk, my face pale and sweating. What was that?" I muttered. Carol had stood up and was staring at me in shock. "What's wrong? Who was it?" I slowly shook my head and repeated what the horrible voice had said. Then the thought came to me that the one that Carol said that she felt was staring at her. Do you think it was your father? I said in a wavering voice. Carol seemed to tense and swiftly shook her head. That's impossible. My dad's dead. It was like all other sound leached out of the room as soon as she finished her sentence. The last word seemed to echo for all eternity inside of my skull. Dead. 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 I felt my throat suddenly constrict as if an invisible hand had caught around it. I gagged and stumbled backwards, my hands raised to try and fight at the invisible fingers, but I only succeeded in gouging out deep cuts of my own throat flesh, and I tried to speak, a gurgling, croaking sound that horrified me. Then who was... I tried to speak, but I could hear a crunching in my neck. Carol was screaming. The darkness was falling upon me in waves. Before you read these moments from my life, I'd like to apologize for the language. I'm trying to recall it from the exact detail. During the months of June, July, and August, I spent many hot summers of my childhood at my grandmother's house, further west on the island of Cape Breton. The forest was plentiful. The plains were vibrant green, and my grandmother's house was a rickety old two-story that was built sometime in the 50s and looked like it didn't belong. Despite its shortcomings, my childhood summers spent here were some of the best I ever had. There were no other children to play with for the next few miles towards town, but I made my own fun running through the fields of grass and smelling flowers in my grandma's garden. I could still recall the smell of my Nana's butterscotch muffins wafting through an open window, sweet and heavenly, and beckoning me inside. I could still remember the sound of cicadas and a warm breeze brushing my skin. I could still remember my grandma's face, watching me from underneath the porch step, smiling with all her teeth and calling me to come inside. There were a lot of rules at my grandma's house, like no running inside the house with my shoes on, not playing in the garden. Some of them didn't make sense to me, like locking the windows and doors before bed, even though we lived miles from society. Turning off the television at 8 and being in bed by 9 was the worst on a night with no school. There were even unspoken rules, ones I didn't ask my grandma about, things like not sleeping with our arms and legs off the bed. Things like checking the window and doors twice. Things like not pulling the shower curtain closed all the way, or hiding under beds and in closets, or pulling the cord to the attic off the nail that it was wrapped around. Though some things were odd, my grandma was a very well-liked woman. She was lithe, and her hair was long, shining in bright silver that looked like it reflected the moonlight. While she usually kept her hair up in a tight bun, making the frown lines on her face prominent. When her hair was down, she could be called beautiful. When my grandpa was alive, he would call her a silver fox, as once she was a young and beautiful and quite tempered. She was the only one that could say something witty and clever to one of my grandpa's quips. Age made her soften herself. Her children made her emotional. My grandpa passing away made her sad and distant, but never once did I question her love for me. Grandpa spent a lot of time out west, so his visits home were rare but wonderful. My grandma used to say she liked having me around when he was gone during the summertime because it made her feel useful. I guess now that I look back on it, my Nana was lonely. I'll try to detail the events that happened chronologically, but I was little, and I blacked out a lot of my childhood here for a good reason. My grandma lived under the house. I never saw her go to bed once. I never thought too much about it, as I was a big kid that could sleep in a bed alone, with my covers tucked around me and my fingers and toes tucked safely away from the edge of the bed. There were quite a few times, though, that she would visit me from the window, standing in her garden bed, to whisper things to me from behind the glass. My grandma's face was pressed up against the window pane, smiling with all her teeth, her hands cupped around her face to see inside a little better. I never questioned it. Why would I? I was just a kid with a silly grandma. There was nothing else to do. "Sweetie, can you open the door for me? I'm a little chilly out here," she told me once, her lips moving just slightly to sound out the words she spoke from behind the glass. The window was up high enough that I could see just above her collarbone, but I could see that she wasn't wearing anything. I laughed a childish laugh and responded with something like, "That's silly, Grandma. You have a key to get inside. Come in before you get cold." Grandma would respond after this, but her smile would never waver, for not even a second. She was still standing in what would have been my Nana's garden. One of the things my grandma wouldn't let me do. Though she wouldn't say anything directly to me, every time I turned away from the window I could hear her whisper things to me. I couldn't make it out, and I thought it could be just nonsense. I didn't turn around to face her. I was uncomfortable with facing her for some reason, and would lay in my bed, listening to her mumble incoherent things, till I would fall asleep. It became like a routine. I would listen to her whisper softly until I slept, and by the morning, she would be in the kitchen, making breakfast and pretending like nothing happened. My grandma would call me silly when I tried to confront her about it, and told me I had a vivid imagination in the way adults would tell kids. I never really brought anything up to her after this. It was like a game between us. Every couple of nights, my grandma would come to the window and tell me to let her inside. Sometimes she would tell me I was a good kid. Sometimes she would tell me I was a bad child. Once, and only once, did I see her smile drift from her face. She had been pestering me every night since she started this game between us. I would ask her, beg her, plead her to just go away and let me sleep. That I was too tired to play and I didn't want to anymore. It wasn't until I got aggravated enough to yell at her that she left me alone for a few days. But not very long. "I already told you I don't want to play anymore. Just come inside yourself and go to sleep." Her smile turned into a frown, but the look in her eyes made me uncomfortable. She didn't whisper to me that night, but every few moments, I would turn around and find her watching me, frowning and glaring. I don't know how I managed to fall asleep, but I do remember waking up to the smell of bacon on the frying pan and the sound of my grandma humming a song. One night, I decided to purposefully unlock the door. I waited until my Nana went to bed to creep across the cold floor, unlock the latches from the front door, and ran to my room to wait underneath the covers for my grandma to finally give the game up. She didn't come to my window that night. She came through my bedroom door. I could hear her get on all fours. I could hear her shuffle across the floor. I could hear her crawl under my bed. And that night, I heard her whispering from underneath my mattress, with my ear pressed up against the bed and the covers pulled over my head. "I'm hungry. I'm so hungry. I can smell you." I shifted in the bed, with my back facing the wall and the window. I didn't want to play this game anymore. "I can smell your liver. The helplessness of knowing there was no one I could call to wake up from this bad dream was a feeling I'd like to never experience again. I'm going to crawl into your insides. I can't tell you what she continued to whisper to me from underneath my mattress. I blocked a lot of it out, curled myself into my blankets, and made sure there was no parts sticking out before I slept. I can tell you that when I opened my eyes, a crack peered out from my blankets. I could see my grandma's eyes watching me from the bottom of my bed. I don't know how long I laid there, paralyzed with fear, but I did fall asleep and managed to wake up the next day without my Nana watching me from under the bed. If she noticed the unlatched door, she didn't say anything. The look she gave me was a curious side-eye as she put eggs on my plate. I can tell I broke her heart a little when I asked to go home. From that night on, to the next few nights before I went home, I made sure the door was locked twice. She visited me repeatedly until I left. I didn't look at the house. I didn't look at the house getting smaller in the rearview mirror, feeling like if I did, I might have seen her watching back. I didn't go back to the house over the summertime. My grandma came to visit me quite a few times at my house, but there was nothing out of the ordinary as far as I can tell. The nightly visits were over, and a few years after that, my grandpa was diagnosed with late-stage Alzheimer's. My grandma and my grandpa were two of the most in-love people that you could have met, without being overly showy. My grandpa's sneaky kisses behind the back of the grandkids and the smile on my grandma's face when he would ask her for coffee was proof. I could see the pain on her face when she would talk about how he forgot her name again that day. I couldn't remember the name of the kids. I watched my grandma suffer through my grandpa's disease as he slipped, and finally slipped away. My grandma died a while after that, hooked up to hospital tubes and being sassy to nurses. Thankfully, she never had to experience the deterioration of her mind as Alzheimer's took her away from us. My grandma was spry, beautiful, clever, and a little weird. It wasn't until we went back to clean her things from her house that I asked my mom about it. She told me a lot of things that I wouldn't have been told as a child. She told me my grandpa was a war veteran who married a much, much younger girl who worked at a flower shop. They lived in poverty for most of their lives, and when he couldn't afford an engagement ring, he built her a house with his own 2 hands instead. I asked her in the middle of this about my childhood. I didn't mention the things I experienced. I felt like she, too, would have given me a flippant wave and a spiel about my imagination as a kid. Your grandma was a little superstitious. For a short time, we thought she might have been getting Alzheimer's herself. My mother sighed as she tucked photographs into a cardboard box. They were just little things, like not remembering where she put her keys, forgetting about doing things in her garden, just little things. Suddenly I felt like there was a weight lifted off my chest. That could have very well been the explanation of the oddities and the weirdness. It felt kind of rude saying it out loud myself. My mother got me to help her pack boxes into the back of her car, ready to start moving out her things from the house and let it become an abandoned shack in the middle of nowhere. When we finished packing, I hopped in the passenger seat, lit up a smoke, and looked back to give one final farewell to the place I spent a lot of time with my favorite grandma in the world. The only thing is, as we were driving back home, why did I see her watching me from underneath the step with a smile on her face and far, far too many teeth?
he just tried to chew in around the doors. And you could see a dog print, alongside the window there.
So the officer and I went out there to take a look at it. And he's tried to chew in around the door, and you can see a dog print outside on the window there. It's obviously a dog. A very strange thing happened after the poem was aired. Somewhere in the northern woods darkness, a creature walks upright, and the best advice you may ever get is to never go out at night. A very strange thing happened after the poem was aired on the radio on April 1st, 1987, and it became obvious the story was not going to fade away. The first 2 times the song was played, there was no viewer reaction or calls. Cook and O'Malley were prepared to let the failed prank die, when the phone lines started lighting up. People were calling in asking about that weird song. Listeners asked, who did that song on that Dogman thing? And when are you going to play it again? O'Malley took a call from an elderly man who stated that he was chilled to the bone after hearing the song because he had actually seen a similar creature years before. That was the first of many sighting reports that would pour into the station over the next few weeks. Scores of people told of stories and encounters with a creature that was very much like Cook's fabricated Dogman. In 1 month, the legend of the Dogman became the most requested song on the air, and for a short time was added into the regular rotation of the music. Other stories began to surface and become compared to the Michigan Dogman story. A century-old, mysterious Indian legend revealed shocking similarities. A French fur trader's diary from 1804 told of an encounter with a beast. A letter from 1857 described a creature that stood upright like a man, yet bore the countenance of a gray wolf. A real Dogman sighting, investigated by Lake County Sheriff Deputy Jeff Chamberlain, who was accompanied by a Department of National Resources officer Ron McCarty, was picked up and reported on by Mark Moretti, a reporter for the Cadillac Evening News. Then other news outlets picked up on the story, and it was later fed down the Associated Press newswire and thus was picked up by newspapers all across America. It was even mentioned as a strange coincidence in Paul Harvey's National News and Comments broadcast. McCarty called the TV station WTCM, stating that he and Chamberlain had only joked about how their sighting would fit in with the 7th-year prophecy made in the song. McCarty's voice would later appear in the beginning of the 10th anniversary version of the song, The Legend 97. Suddenly, The Legend soared into national prominence and became a hit song once again. Only this time on a much larger scale. Requests for copies came in from all 50 states and around the world. Eventually, the master tape, never considered to be of real value, had been destroyed, and Stephen Cook went into the studio again, this time with an upgraded keyboard, and recorded the song a second time. A few changes were made to the lyrics to update the legend for summer, and when it was finished, the second master recording was shipped to Southernfield, Michigan for mass production. The first 500 copies arrived a week later, and sold out in 12 days. The legend had quickly become a hot property with record stores and record stations across the country calling the station requesting copies. A large recording company offered to record and promote the song, and Steve Cook faced a difficult decision of whether to release the legend on a national scale or keep it local and manageable. Steve chose to keep it local. The music and lyrics were copyrighted by Mindstage Productions, Steve's marketing and advertising company. More and more copies of the tape, which was originally priced at $3, were sold, and in the fall of 1987, WTCM held an art contest which allowed amateur artists the chance to submit works depicting what they thought the Dogman looked like. There were over 100 entries. Some were exceptional, but by far the most chilling and dramatic was an 11x17 charcoal sketch done by Brian Rosinski, who was only 23 years old at the time and never had a formal art lesson. The song was never intended to be a marketable vehicle of profit, and Cook made the decision early on that any profits earned derived from its sales would be donated to charity. The first charity was the Traverse City Cherryland Humane Society, which scored $2,500 towards drilling a new water well and the remodeling of the adult dog facility, which included new floor tile and pens. In 2001, Cook was introduced to Brian Manley, former owner of AC Paw, a no-kill animal shelter program that specialized in lost cases. AC Paw takes in animals that had been injured, abused, or neglected, or that had used up the maximum boarding time in traditional facilities and had to be euthanized. AC Paw takes in animals that have been injured, abused, or neglected, or that had used up the maximum boarding time in traditional facilities and are about to be euthanized. They rehabilitate animals through a unique foster care network and eventually place them into loving homes. Cook was impressed with the AC Paw program. He shifted all donations from the proceeds of the legend to their cause, and thus the legend of the Dog Man's legacy lives on for animals in need. While the legend has never been formally distributed for airplay on other radio stations, it's been heard across the US and the world. Many young adults grow up hearing it and remember it scaring them at summer campfire storytelling sessions. The legend has inspired movie screenplays, stage productions, numerous books, term papers, at least one master's thesis, and countless classroom projects. In spite of the initial belief that the song would be a radio bit designed to run one day only, interest in the legend continues to grow. Steve Cook receives 10 to 20 reported sightings each year, many supported by dramatic evidence. Perhaps the best description of the legacy of the legend came from WTCM's morning host Jack O'Malley. The song has been firmly woven into the fabric of northern Michigan. It's part of the culture now, part of the folklore. The legend will be here long after we're gone. Big Rapids, 1961. When I was a boy, my father was the night watchman at a manufacturing plant located in the rural areas between Big Rapids and Chippewa Lake. Our house, which, if I remember right, was a perk of the night watchman's job, was across the street from the factory. The plant building was right next to a large wilderness area of state land. At that time, it was simply known as Haymarsh. Now it's officially called Haymarsh State Game Area. We didn't understand it at the time, but my dad was always very skittish about letting us play outside after dark. Sometimes talk about how he'd hear coyotes or bears roaming around the Haymarsh. He was walking with the perimeter of the building at night. But one night in the summer of 1961, Dad walked back to the house to sit on the porch and have a cup of coffee and sweet roll. He had a good view of the entire plant property. Saw some movement near a chain-link fence behind the building. This was approximately 3 a.m. So he felt quite sure this person wasn't there by accident. He drew his gun and he watched for a few minutes. That's when he noticed this was not a person at all. Something much taller. He said it appeared to be covered in brown-gray fur. It had very broad shoulders and a powerful chest. It alternated between walking on all fours and standing up on two. He said it seemed to be looking for something along this driveway. He said later he couldn't quite believe what he was seeing. He quietly moved into the house and grabbed the Kodak Signet 35mm camera, which was his pride and joy. Now at this point, I should mention that Dad was quite a photography buff. His father had owned one of the first camera stores in Ohio. Dad got this shutter bug from Grandpa. Well, as he stepped back onto the porch, the creature moved slowly along the driveway, directly onto the lights. He adjusted the camera shutter for a long exposure, held it as still as he could. He said that he had pretty bad shakes by then. He snapped a picture. Now, I put the picture along with this letter. Dad said a few seconds later the thing dropped back onto all fours and slowly moved off into the woods. He sent a print to the local newspaper, sent copies to several magazines. One, I think, was called Mysterion, published the photo in the spring issue of 1962. Dad had a copy of the magazine for years, but it was misplaced after he passed away. I still have the negative strip that contains this image. We'd like to have someone examine it. I also still have Dad's Kodak Signet. I haven't shot any pictures with it for several years, but I'm pretty sure it still works. Sparta, 1978. One weekend back around fall of 1978, my two best friends and I were staying at a family's cabin, which is not far away from the small town of Sparta, about 20 minutes north of Grand Rapids. My two friends left to have dinner while I stayed behind at the cabin. Following the dinner, the men headed back towards Sparta and the cabin. What happened next would shock and disturb them for years. It was dark, and they were on a rural road. Suddenly, both of them saw something standing out on the side of the road. In the headlights of the car, it appeared to be a human-like figure covered in gray fur. As they get closer and past the figure, both of them get a very good look at it. It was the size of a man, stood on two legs. It was covered head to toe in gray fur and had this wolf-like face. It even raised its hands and seemed to snarl at them as they drove by. They said it looked like a werewolf out of a Hollywood movie. My two friends didn't stop. They continued driving, and of course, they were peppering each other with questions. Do you see that too? Was that a dog? Was that someone dressed in a costume? And so on. As they are having this animated conversation, they pass by the signs that say, "Welcome to Sparta," and drove through the small main street and continued on out of the town in the direction of my cabin. Their conversation about what had just happened continued when both of them looked up to see that same "Welcome to Sparta" sign again, followed by the same main street that they had just driven through only moments ago. They hadn't stopped or turned around. They had been traveling in the same direction on the same road, but somehow, without any noticeable interruptions in their journey, they somehow had been sent backwards several miles. I remember when they finally showed up in my cabin. They arrived no later than what I had expected them to. Around maybe 9 p.m. or so. And I remember how animated they were about this strange encounter, but I just assumed they had seen a large dog, or they were telling me an embellished story in order to get a laugh. But 20 minutes later, both of them insisted that this was no joke. I have no idea what to make of this story. Maybe it was just some teenagers in a werewolf costume playing pranks. And did my friends really experience lost time afterwards? Or did they just make some wrong turns on their drive and didn't notice because they were talking and distracted? I have no idea. But I would love to know if anybody else has seen something similar in the Sparta area. Reed City, 1993. The area around Reed City, Michigan has been a hotbed for dogman activity. This report details an event that occurred nearly 20 years ago, but the witness remembers it like it was yesterday and is unshaken in her story. Her name is Courtney, and her encounter took place during the winter of 1993 to 1994. Courtney was a teenager at the time, was sneaking cigarettes behind her parents' house near Todd Lake. The sun was setting on a clear, cold winter day. Courtney was facing a large abandoned barn on the property next door. The barn had always kind of spoke to me. It was filled with rusty old equipment. The outer planks were all rotten, and it sagged and leaned in every direction. My dad said to stay away, as the whole thing could collapse. On that evening, I was standing about 15 feet from the barn and saw sunlight coming through the gaps in the siding. Courtney took her eyes off the barn for a few minutes, then something caught her attention. There was some movement, the light flickering, but I couldn't really tell what it was. Then it turned its head back and looked straight at me. It was at least 6 feet tall, if not more. It was dark-colored. It had a dog-like appearance, a pointy nose, and a really big pointy ears. Courtney dashed into her house and grabbed the flashlight. When she returned outside, she shined it toward the barn door, but the animal was no longer there. She walked closer to the barn to look for tracks in the heavy snow. When she didn't see any, she realized the creature might still be inside, and ran back to the safety of the house. She never saw the creature again. She later talked to the neighbor, who had seen something the size of a buffalo, but the shape of a dog, in the same barn a few months earlier before Courtney's encounter. The neighbor had said she had been so frightened she was in near hysterics for days. Her father had taken his gun and searched the barn, but found nothing there. At the time of these events, neither of the girls had heard the legend song, and did not know about the Michigan Dogman until years later. Watersmeet, 1994. This report comes to us from an anonymous contributor who grew up in Sheboygan County. but spent many summers camping on family property in Michigan's Upper Peninsula. The encounter took place in the area of Watersmeet, home of the famous Paulding Lights phenomena. Oddly enough, the Paulding Lights are now known as Dog Meadow Lights. I was 13. I had just gotten new rollerblades for Christmas, and since the main road where our property sits is paved, I couldn't wait to ride around. I went blading myself and stopped to rest for a second. On the road, the woods were thick. There's not much space between the road and the woods, in most parts. I remember seeing trees pushed down on the road that my dad said were done by bears. He was an avid bear hunter. I remember not hearing any of your normal sounds of nature, not even birds. The air was still. The sky would be pure dark and not too long. I was deciding to turn back when I heard a rustling behind me, and something emerged from the left side of the road. I assumed it was a deer and paused, but made myself as quiet as I could so I could watch it. I slumped down on my stomach in the middle of the road. It was about 600 feet ahead of me. When I got myself settled onto the road to watch it and looked up, I realized what I was looking at wasn't a deer. It was on all fours, gray-brown fur. First, I feared the worst, thinking a bear had caught my scent until I saw that it had this outline and color. I thought it was looking like a dog until I realized the face was too primitive, like a fox or a coyote's. At this point in my life, I had never seen a wolf in real life, and it was too far for me to make out the face exactly. The Michigan Department of Natural Resources had always recognized that wild wolves still roamed in the Upper Peninsula, although they were thought to be in very limited numbers, and only in extremely remote areas. It is conceivable this witness was seeing one of these wolves, but then, something very strange happens. It extended its front legs, and in the slowest, longest seconds of my life, stood up on its hind legs and sniffed the air. Walked for about 5 steps, then got back down on all fours and walked to the other side of the woods. Then it disappeared. I don't remember how long I laid in the middle of the road, staring at the empty space that I saw this thing stand like a human. I remember my jaw hanging down as low as it could, and a pool of drool in the cement under it. It finally clicked in my mind that perhaps I should rollerblade my butt back to camp as quickly as I could. The witness reports that since the creature never stalked or pursued, they slept very little during the rest of the family trip. They never told anyone about what they had seen, fearing they'd be ridiculed. At the time of the sighting, they never heard the legend song and would not until 2004. They moved to Southern California in 2008 and had no interest in camping ever since. Alpena, 2001. My dad and I have a story to tell about our encounters with the Dogman. My dad's story took place in the mid-70s. There was this cemetery behind the Alpena High School, and a wooded area behind that. There are many trails that run there, and in this area is a place called the Sandies, where all the young kids would go and they would party. My dad and 2 of his buddies were in a canoe in broad daylight, paddling from the Sandies around the back of the cemetery. The bank of the rivers were about 10 to 12 feet high in places, and some trails run right to the edge. The 3 of them saw what looked to be a big dog running behind them on the trail. Didn't pay much attention to it until they heard a splash. When they looked, it was swimming after them. Then it went from a dog paddle to the chest and front legs coming out of the water and wading after them. They decided right then and there not to wait around and see what it was. Honestly, I thought it was BS at the time, and I'm still not sure even to this day if it was something that they had been smoking or drinking. And then around 2001 to 2002, I was leading some friends through the Sandies trails. I used to like taking people out there without a flashlight, telling them my dad's story to freak them out. The girls were freaked out before we even got into the woods, so I decided not to scare them that night. In the river are several islands connected by a smaller sliver of land. At the time, there were 3 such islands chained together, and I took them through the last one, which was planted with pines in this nice even row. I was the first one back there, about 30 seconds ahead, when one of the girls got her foot hung up on something. Now, as I was going back to help her, there was a spot where the trees make a sort of roof effect, which is really cool looking at night. with the moon shining through. And at that point, I saw something. I'm not sure what it was, but it sent me running out double time. When my buddy saw my face, he didn't say a word, he just followed, both of us dragging the girls behind us. When he asked me later why I came out in such a hurry, I told him it was because I thought that I had seen something at the other end of the island walking through the trees that was very tall, very not likely human. He may not have believed me, but he never questioned either. I'm still not sure what I saw. It could easily have been that I scared myself with Dad's story and was seeing things, but I know this. I still don't like the dark. And even though I love hunting, I still hate going out before the sun comes up during deer season. Bendon, 2007. This sighting report is told secondhand by the brother-in-law of the witness. The witness is a prominent person in the local government and wishes to remain anonymous. The situation started last Saturday night, around midnight, when he was coming home from a friend's house in Benzania, and taking the back way home to Traverse City. He stated that while traveling down Cinder Road, several miles outside of the town of Bendon, he observed a pair of eyes reflecting off his headlights ahead of him. Thinking that it was probably a deer along the side of the road, he began to slow down. As he got closer, however, he stated that the object was much larger and much darker than a deer. He said that by this time, he had slowed to around 30 miles per hour and was at that point several hundred feet from the creature, which still hadn't been moving. As he approached further, he stated that the only way that he could describe the creature was being similar to a very large, dark wolf. However, he observed that this thing wasn't on all fours, but was upright, with his back two legs standing near a road-killed deer. He estimated that the creature stood a little over 6 feet tall and had very dark fur. He stated that by now, he was going slow enough to bring his truck to a stop in the road and observe the creature, which had not yet moved, still staring at him. He told me that for the briefest of seconds, he believed the object was a giant stuffed animal put there on some kind of joke, due to the fact that he had never seen anything like this in his life, and that he was able to drive up on it as close as he was, without it moving an inch. He told me, however, that before he could finish that thought, the creature then dropped to all fours and sprinted across the road and disappeared into the woods, on the other side of the road. He told me that he stayed frozen in his seat for a few minutes, wondering, in the middle of the road, what the heck had just happened. I jokingly asked him if he had been drinking that night, and with a deadly serious face, he stated no. Whatever that was, it was for real. As perplexed as he was that night over what he'd seen, he was deathly afraid to go wandering into the woods to investigate further. He said that in using a flashlight, he observed an animal's tracks leading into the woods on the opposite side of the road, and was fortunate enough that night to have his digital camera with him. He showed me a photograph of the paw print, which he said appeared to be around 7 or 8 inches long. He had another piece of the same paw print where he placed a shotgun shell in the middle of it for scale. He told me that he was lucky the side of the road was so soft because he wasn't willing to go any further than 2 or 3 steps away from the door of his truck to get a picture. I inquired if the animal had made any sound before it disappeared. He said that he didn't hear it make any noise, and were it not for the picture, he would have thought that he had imagined the whole thing. I asked him if it could have been a bear. He stated absolutely not. He bear hunts every year on the Upper Peninsula, so he obviously knew what bears look like up close. That's his story. Believe it if you like. If I didn't know him as well as I did, and hadn't seen the pictures, I would have said that he was out of his mind. I've heard the song. Know some of the stories, but I always believed it was just for entertainment value. After this happened, though, looking at all this under a whole new light. Hey there, kid. I'm writing to tell you how I really feel. You probably didn't notice, but for the longest time, I've always been there for you. I want you to know what I've done. And I hope by me opening up to you like this, you will hopefully feel the same way. And we can be happy together. Forever. I remember when we were both 13, when you first transferred to my school. As soon as you walked in, I thought that you were the most beautiful girl in the world. And your tranquil blue eyes crossed mine, even though it was for a brief moment. As you scanned across the strange faces in the class, I knew I wanted to be with you. Forever. But I was heartbroken. Straight away. When you paired off by some other guy to show you around the school. You didn't really notice me much. You were always with your group of friends who were so different to mine. And who am I kidding? I never really had any friends. The one thing that got me through all those years of loneliness was watching you. Admiring everything you did. The way you gracefully went through your day without faults simply left me in awe, day in and day out. As the years went by, you seemed pretty popular with both the girls and the guys, and you were sought after by all the popular guys in the whole school, even the older ones. You shrugged them off. The girls loved how you looked after yourself. You always had your makeup and hair product, which made you admired, but hated. Sad. It's human nature to get jealous, and we're all guilty of this crime. What they ended up doing, however, was far out of line. Saw as they pushed you when the teachers weren't looking. Shove you into any nearby hard objects, which more often than not was the wall. When you stumbled and slammed into the wall, the teachers would simply turn and say, "Watch where you're going, dear," and then go about their business, blissfully unaware of what actually happened. Witnessing it happen every other day burned me up inside. Watching you have this torment for being better than them, it was a punishment to watch every time it happened. I hoped it would die down, but it got worse. I saw when the bullies would knock your drink over when you least expected, just because the most popular guy asked you out. I was there when they set your bag on fire in the woodworks class because they thought that you were condescending when you tried to help them with their work. And I caught a glimpse of them one time when they actually threw you to the ground outside of the school gates, and they kicked you until you cried. Simply because you tried to tell the teachers about what they were doing. After that incident, they followed you home. Usually, they wouldn't do anything but yell abuse at you. I wanted to fix it. What I knew was there was 3 main bullies that were consistent. Of course, I knew of more, but they seemed to do it out of peer pressure. The main culprit was that narcissistic whore, Bethany. Beth was simply jealous of everything about you. All the things I mentioned that made you great burn her up inside. She used to be the center of attention, and my God, did she love it. All the guys wanted to be with her. All the girls wanted to be her. The only difference is that she abused that attention for personal gain. She slept with most of the guys who showered her in gifts or had their mommy and daddy to pay for everything. She only hung around with girls whom she deemed lower than her. And she did this so they won't be a threat to her God complex. But slowly over the years of you being in school, she eventually lost her reputation, and by then, all the attention was on you. The second who had a disgruntled grudge against you was that asshole Chris. He asked you to the school annual dance in front of both his friends and yours, and you simply rejected him like many others. But what made his instance different was that he ran off crying because he was publicly embarrassed. In school, that meant a lot. He denied liking you and lost all his friends and reputation, so he took his frustrations out on who he thought had caused all of it. You. And the last person was Julie. She had it bad for you ever since the guy she liked always talked about how amazing you were. I was not paying her any attention. Even after she performed some, well, let's say, desperate deeds for him. During the last week of school, I knew they had something special planned for you, so I took it into my own hands to deal with it because I love you. And I didn't want your last few days at school to be ruined. The first person I convinced to not mess with you anymore was Chris. He was much stronger than me, being in all those sports. Plus, the steroids meant that I wouldn't be able to take him on a simple one-on-one fight. But in the end, that would be his downfall. I knew where he kept his steroids. It wasn't hard to figure out since our school's security and reputation was low. There was no need to hide it. I got his locker combination by simply saying I forgot mine, and the teacher gave me a list of everyone's combinations. Yeah, that's right. They have no sense of security in this school. So I cracked open his locker with ease, leaving no trace of it ever being opened. Found the next shot that he was going to use and squirted a little bit out, then pulled the syringe plunge back to where it was, leaving a considerable-sized air bubble. Now, I figured Chris is no doctor, nor does he have any clue how everything works altogether. He just injects himself and trains in the school gym. Bought a pass for the gym, and pretended to train. He eventually came into the gym, laughing hysterically with his new friends. Enjoy it while you can, it's not going to last long. A thought that creeped up into my head. He went to his locker, and not long after that came out in his training attire, with a determined look on his face. He was ready to start. He was fine for a while, but eventually slowed down. He had a puzzled look on his face, as his body slowly gave up, and eventually the cardiac arrest set in. He was on the floor. People tried CPR, but there was no defibrillator around, and since it was a school filled with teenagers, well, who would expect a heart attack in a place like this? I smiled, and I walked out before the paramedics had even arrived. It was already too late for him. Working my way up the list, Julie was next. She was always jealous of the way every guy liked you. And I silently slipped through her window without her noticing. I knew her parents were out, so if she made a noise, no one would immediately come to her aid. I pounced on her while she was asleep, pinning her down. I tied her hands to the bedposts and then her legs. I pulled out several jars from my bag, each one almost black. But upon closer inspection, we would see small movements. They were full of all the creepy crawlers that one would typically find in the bottom of anyone's garden. I took my time, filling these up with every insect I could find. I wanted her to understand all the pain that she must have felt all the times that she had shouted at you, hurting you, making you feel lower than you already are. So I propped her mouth open with one of those little plastic rings that doctors would use for a long procedure, and I slowly poured each jar down her throat. Every time her screaming was muffled a little more by the buzzing and scuttering noises and the clicking of carapaces that the bugs made as they adjusted to their new home. A few jars in and I could feel the bugs in her stomach, which was where I had been sitting the whole time. By this time she was pretty much passed out from the pain. And when this happened, I'd wait. I'd pour water on her face and slap her until she responded. And for punishment, I'd take off the ring from her mouth and pour water down her throat, making her swallow all those little insects, causing them to go into a frenzy of panting. Eventually, during the 5th jar, the pain of all the insects, those burrowing into her organ, plus all the internal bleeding, caused her to pass away. But not peacefully, mind you. And I saved the worst for last. I had something special planned for Bethany. Well, she was the worst to you. She made your life a living hell, and this was unacceptable. No one as perfect as you should have ever had the displeasure of knowing these people, so I carefully set the pieces. And I waited. One day I got a head start. I just skipped the last class, but no one noticed, not even the teacher. This shows how much I was noticed in school. By this time I had memorized her route home and waited in an archway. I knew she walked past this area every time. I waited and thought about what I was going to do and how it was all for you. Although I didn't have to think so much because I already had it all planned out. When I caught sight of her, I grabbed her and I pulled her to the ground. She was kicking and screaming, but in that point in her journey, no one was ever around. The archway had led to an abandoned, derelict church. I dragged her away from the path to the building so that no witness could intervene or find her body anytime soon. I did my routine of securing her arms and legs to a post, so I knew there wouldn't be that much of a struggle, and after that I gagged her. I knew she'd make a lot of noise from what I was about to do. I slowly pulled out my knife, making sure that she caught sight of its shiny glimmer. Placed the point of it onto her lower leg and smiled as she reacted to the sharp point of the blade. I pushed down, making sure the wound was clean as it slowly, so slowly slipped into her flesh. It took a while, but eventually the knife handle was touching her skin. I took my time pulling it out, making sure that the wound didn't rupture. That easily recognized crimson liquid. Oh, that would have meant death. That would be too easy. As soon as that type of knife exited her body, I immediately wrapped the slip with a bandage, applying enough pressure to cut the bleeding down to a minimum. Then I placed the knife a little higher up her leg, doing the same thing. I stared into her eyes. She helplessly watched me do this over and over, all over her body. After each stab, I'd say a remark about how you didn't deserve what she did to you. Eventually, her whole body was nothing but red bandages. She was barely conscious as I slipped the final blow right into her heart. I can imagine you're screaming about now. In fact, I know you will be, and I'll be close enough to hear it. And by you stopping, I know you've gotten this far into my letter, so I think I'm gonna make my way in. You know, it's pretty easy to get into your house after the last few times. You probably thought it was your parents who left this note in your room in the first place. No, it was me. But please don't be afraid. The noise is downstairs, okay? It's only me. You can put down your phone. I know by now that you've got it in your hand. I've already cut the phone line. I've already jammed the cell signal. Don't bother calling your parents. If you haven't done so already, I've already silenced them. Please, you can stop your screaming now. Now, I'm always right outside your door. You can unlock it. Please. And soon it'll just be you and me. Forever. Lots of love. Signed, your secret admirer. Have you ever wanted to know a particular person better? To be able to predict his or her every move and reaction, be familiar with all of his or her tastes, and see right through his or her personality so that you can be wiser? If so, then you may embark on a journey. There you'll find your answers. Or so the forgotten ruins of Aztecs dictate. Needless to say, it'll be dangerous, and the burden of risk very heavy. Your intentions may be as innocent as trying to comprehend the person you love, or give a heartwarming surprise to a friend or family member, or it may be sinister as to use the information that you were given to manipulate and thwart someone you loathe. It may even be wanting to know a very influential person, so you may appease that person with ease. Regardless, I'll not judge your intentions, but beware. Because you will be evaluated, and the basis of that analysis is not only obscure, but seemingly random. So don't think that you're sure to get out unscathed just because you wanted to know your love's dream honeymoon getaway to impress him or her. This is the price of the knowledge that will be bestowed upon you. You need some hair from the head of the person of interest. Even a single strand will do. And you're good to go. Tucked away in the dense foliage, there's a sacred yet forbidden retreat somewhere along the banks of the Amazon. It lurks in the nooks and crannies of the marshy vegetation, its whereabouts ever-changing. Mortals are only tolerated on a full moon night. The place can never be located otherwise. Start looking, riding a boat, preferable ones that make minimal noise as the moon makes its first appearance. Reaching the entrance before midnight is a prerequisite. Keep your ears on patrol. You're listening out for a distant hiss. One not so dissimilar to a snake's, or one audible when you twist open the stopper of a carbonated beverage. It's said to be calling to you, more like a challenge, in their decipherable tongue. As if they're saying, "Do you think you're worthy?" If you're able to hear a hiss, stop the boat. Try to locate it. Once you have a rough geological estimate, anchor your boat along the bank and start foraging. You must leave anyone you brought with you on the boat. Otherwise, the place will not show up. Look for a cave. It should be just enough specifically for someone of your height to enter. You may use a light source to illuminate your path as you search, but the eerie yet glaring moonlight should suffice. As soon as you spot the cave, extinguish your light source, leave all technology behind, otherwise they'll be incapacitated. Bear nothing with you other than your clothing and the hair. The moonlight should create a lighting synonymous to the rustic images of early television, devoid of color, ominously monochromatic. Muster up your courage. You'll need every ounce of it. And walk inside. It'll be pitch black at first, so walk cautiously to make sure that you don't get lost. Use the walls to navigate. Feel for a pattern of carved series of circles at the height of your hands. There will be diverted paths and forks. Feel for the pattern. I must stress that you do not follow any walls that do not have the pattern. Around 5 minutes in, you'll hear footsteps behind you and ahead of you. Don't panic. The noise from footsteps will vary. Some light, others heavy. Some will correspond to strolling, other pacing and even running. Things will brush past you occasionally and even bump into you, only to immediately dart away. Do not heed them. Move forward, and after a while you'll see a light as if one at the end of a tunnel. The walls bearing the circles around you lead you right here. Shafts of moonlight will riddle the pathway, illuminating the circle pattern so you no longer have to feel. Proceed with a steady pace. No need to run or lag. The footsteps will cease. You might curse your peripheral vision, for shadows will linger at the corner of your eyes, only to fall back as you turn around, but you need not worry. Keep walking. Occasionally you'll come across diverted pathways. Something will be standing there. A gray and indiscernible figure mottled with inky stains of black. Unlike the others, will not retreat from your plane of sight. On the contrary, it will gesture to you. Run. You must run past all these pathways, otherwise... I'll get to that. That thing will scream and chase after you, but you must not stop and you must not look back. You may stop when the footsteps die away, and after what might seem like an hour or so, you will have reached your destination, an enormously spacious room. Enter the room and you'll see a stone altar illuminated by a single moonlight beam descending from the ceiling. Patterns similar to the circles on the walls will have embellished its every surface. Everything else will be hiding under the cover of darkness. As you make your way up to the altar, you might be greeted by the whispers and hisses from the darkness that surround you. There'll be occasional shrieks and undulating moans. Something might screech as if right beside you, or right behind you. Jump scares are always on the table, anything to draw your attention. Whatever you do, do not look. Keep your eyes on the altar at all times. When you've reached the center, sit down with your legs crossed. The full moon will be visible through the slit on the roof. As it pools, the altar with its ghastly yet eerily mysterious light. Place the hair at the center and take a deep breath. Close your eyes and pronounce in a low voice, as humbly as you can, "Face Keeper, bestow upon me your knowledge." The noises in the darkness will halt. Open your eyes and look at the hair. The hair will be set ablaze, but not by conventional fire. The tiny flames will emanate a soft white, opalescent glow. Your body will note a steep temperature drop. There will be a presence around you, which you will find to be oddly reminiscent. Whose face do you desire to know by heart? The question will come from a random direction. Keep staring at the fire. The voice will be none other than your own, grim and solemn, and it will speak in the same language you used to summon it. Say the person's name. There'll be a period of silence. Don't look up or make any kind of noise. Remain seated as you are. Why do you want to know that face by heart? Again, from a random location in the same voice and language, state your intention as honestly as you can. It should be obvious that you mustn't lie. In the case that you do, remember that it will not only know of it, but also take account of that lie when judging you. There will be a longer period of silence. I urge you to remain as you are. Are you worthy? A voice will suddenly reveal itself behind you. Don't take your eyes off the flames. As adamantly as you can, say, yes. As soon as you do, the flames will flare. As soon as you do, the flames will flare for a split second and extinguish themselves. You will hear a multitude of malevolent hisses all around you. A grim, spiteful aura will burden the air. You'll be under the impression that an otherworldly presence is approaching you from far ahead. Stay as you are and keep staring at the ashes. At one point, all noise will reach an abundant halt. A violent surge of wind will blow the ashes onto you and you will black out. You open your eyes to the cacophony of birds rising at the dawn. You'll be lying at the place where you spotted the cave, only the cave will be no more. Rise, gather up your things, and go back to the boat. Now you can naturally think exactly like your desired person, as if you can dress yourself in that person's very mental makeup. Of course, you can take it off just as easily. In the case you are not worthy, be prepared to face nothing but sheer confusion and frustration for the rest of your life. The Facekeeper will have robbed you of who you are. You'll know nothing, no memories, no language, nothing. All that will be left is instinct. Your mentality will be linked to a newborn baby, awed at the world around you as if seeing it for the first time. Now as for my warning. If you looked up while talking to the Facekeeper, didn't know the wall, or responded to the modeled figure's beckons, the outcome's the same, immortality. Sounds great, doesn't it? Yeah. It's like those shadowy figures of the modeled summoner, trapped in that lair for all eternity, rejected by death itself. I just wanted more friends, that's all. Now if you make it out successful, there's no catches, no restrictions. You've been deemed worthy. You're free to proceed, using your newfound prowess in any way you see fit, feeling powerful, wanting more. You can, if you want to. Take some hair off the person and return to the Amazon. Go through it again. You've done it once, it's no problem. But be warned. The Facekeeper doesn't take ambition too kindly. I suggest you stop to listen. But your chances of being deemed worthy twice in a row is much slimmer. And what if you aren't? Will the face keeper snatch away your ability? No. Oh no, you can keep that. It'll take away you and only you. But hey, you got someone else's personality, right? Sure you do. Good luck being that person when he or she legitimately exists. You know that you're you, so why is that person claiming to be you? Why is your mom calling him or her child? Why is your lover sleeping with that person? He or she is the real deal. You're just a cloned personality stuffed into a now unknown body. Identity theft with an unexpected twist, don't you think? Makes you wonder whether losing the first time around was better. If this doesn't bother you, though, go on. Sail along the Amazon in the moonlight, seeking that hiss. I wish you good luck, but don't forget to ask yourself, are you worthy? Our company had been tasked with a geological survey of Fallen Field Mountain in southwestern Kentucky. Situated at the intersection of the Cumberland and Allegheny Mountains at the Cumberland Plateau, it stands at the center of a depression in the terrain entirely uncharacteristic of the surrounding area. Having recently acquired a permit for the state for a fracking extraction, the petroleum company that hired us was anxious to see what they could exploit in this new area. We were to set out as soon as possible. We began our hike on a Monday morning. The weather was predicted to be favorable, and the four of us were excited to cover some ground. We stopped at a small store near the edge of the forest to purchase last-minute supplies and anything else we thought that we might need. It wasn't a particularly difficult journey ahead of us, but we wanted to be prepared. While we were browsing, an employee began a conversation with Jake Lemond, one of our geologists. Jake was forthcoming, as we were under no obligation to keep our work secret. I walked the aisles and drifted in and out of their conversation, which grew noticeably more animated as time went by. The employee was not keen on the mountain being used for petroleum exploration. It turned out he wasn't speaking from an environmental standpoint. In the 1940s and 1950s, multiple coal companies had attempted to mine the area around Fallen Field Mountain. Each attempt had resulted in the deaths of local miners, due to the hideous regulatory framework surrounding the mining industry in the mid-20th century. Little was done about it. The companies just shut down the mines and moved everywhere else. According to the employee who had lost his father in one of those accidents, we were setting ourselves up for another disaster. Undeterred, we began our trek at 10 a.m. As expected, the first day's hike was pleasant. Gorgeous weather and lovely scenery kept our spirits high. Around 6:30 p.m., we set up camp for the night. Raphael built a fire while Jake and Mateo went fishing in the nearby river. An hour later, they came back with a couple beautiful fish. They scaled and cleaned them, and before I knew it, we were enjoying a spectacular meal in the woods. We had 2 tents, and I shared mine with Raphael. We got to sleep shortly after 9 p.m. Around 2 a.m., we were awakened by a strange droning sound far off in the distance. "There's a military base about 100 miles from here," Ralph told me. "Sounds like they're doing engine testing or something." I nodded and forgot about it. I slept like a log for the rest of the night. We broke down the tents and were all packed up by 7:30 the next morning. We ate on the go. The walk grew more difficult as the terrain became more rugged. We were in the mountains now. They weren't sheer, towering slabs of rock, but they still took time to hike up and over, or in most cases go around. We were decked out with climbing equipment for when we needed to climb, and once we reached Fallen Field, we knew we had to, but we wanted to keep it to a minimum. Despite us all being trained climbers, we didn't feel like we needed to take any unnecessary risks. Toward the middle of the day, we heard the droning sound again. It was louder now, and birds looked to the air, squawking in protest. The 4 of us looked around, trying to get an idea of where it could be coming from. Ralph reiterated his explanation to Mateo and Jake about the military base, but he seemed more uncertain this time. We'd been walking in the opposite direction of the base all day. The sound should have gotten quieter. It wasn't. We pushed ahead, interrupted frequently by the drone and subsequent stopping and speculating by the 4 of us about what it could be. Jake even used the sat phone to call up the company and ask if there was any industries or stations in the area that we didn't know about. In fact, there were. We pushed ahead, interrupted frequently by the drone and the subsequent stopping. The abandoned remains of 3 coal mining operations stood on the edge of the basin surrounding Fallen Field Mountain. None of them had been used since the late 1950s and had long succumbed to the wilderness. In the 1990s, the state had set crews to the sites to seal up the more dangerous aspects of the facilities, like the mine shafts, the furnaces, and whatnot. But from what our company would tell us, their multiple flyover surveys showed no activity around there whatsoever. If the sound was coming from those abandoned sites, they had no idea why. This information did little to put us at ease. Toward the end of the day, when they were setting up camp, I realized it'd been hours since we'd heard the droning. I felt good about that, and the feeling lasted about 3 hours. That was when it started to rain. Jake called the company and we had bad news. It looked like there was a cold front that had reached us sooner than expected. The next 48 hours were going to be a washout. We were encouraged to continue walking, but we were cautioned to take our time and be careful. The rain pelted our tents all night and soaked us from head to toe the next day. Rivers swelled and ran over the banks, dirt became clingy mud, and visibility went down to only a few feet. Still, onward we trudged. There was no hint of the droning noise at all that day, and after a while, it had been 24 hours since we had last heard it. All we heard was the rain, wind, and the cascade of profanity from our group as we tried to push forward. Mid-afternoon, the rain intensified. We gave up trying to walk and set up camp. Everything was muddy. Everything was wet. Everything was cold. We huddled together and shared a bottle of whiskey that Mateo had brought, which helped a little. When it was dark, Jake and Mateo decided to call it a night and went over to their own tent. Ralph zipped himself in his sleeping bag and was snoring within 3 minutes. Eventually, I fell asleep and was met by frequent, vivid nightmares. The drone permeated my dreams and carried unintangible whispers within it. I felt like I was being pulled through the forest towards those abandoned mining facilities and the mountain behind them. At some point after dawn, after Ralph had left the tent to presumably take a leak, he rushed back and declared, "Matt and Jake are gone." Still bleary-eyed from the atrocious night of sleep I'd gotten, I croaked out, "What?" "Mateo, Jake, they're gone. Their tent is wrecked and they left a trail of their stuff going out into the woods." Now Ralph had my full attention. What are you talking about?" I asked, knowing exactly what he was talking about, but still unable to comprehend why they would have done something like that. "Let's go," Ralph said as he started packing up. I extricated myself from the sleeping bag and got dressed. Ralph pulled the tent down after me. Within 10 minutes, we were following the trail of food and sleeping bags and clothing through that sloping forest. "Did you call Becky and Hanson? Let them know what's happening?" I asked Ralph. He shook his head. "Jake has a sat phone." We traveled in silence for well over an hour. Neither of us had experienced tracking anything through the woods, let alone in the driving rain. Still, Jake and Mateo had left a trail of belongings that made it easy enough. We found the sat phone, waterlogged and destroyed, in a puddle next to a tree. We found their shirts soon afterward, and their pants, and their shoes. 8 hours later, I looked at my watch. 3 p.m. The rain pummeled us. "How far do you figure we are from those mining facilities?" I asked Ralph. "Hard to tell. We're probably a few hours away, and another hour or two from Fallen Field." Sure enough, 3 hours later, as the light in the forest washed away, we stood in front of a large, dilapidated industrial building. One of the mining facilities. Ralph noticed one of the windows on the ground floor was broken, and he suggested we go inside and set up camp for the night. I stared at the rusty metal facade of the old building. I didn't like the look of it, not at all. Still, with daylight ticking away and the constant goddamn rain, I knew it was what we had to do. We climbed in. It was dark inside. Not pitch black, but hazy gray. The windows were covered in grime and let in the little that remained of daylight. Shadowy silhouettes of decaying mining equipment loomed around us. Ore extractors, conveyor belts, furnaces, and a whole bunch of things that I couldn't recognize. The air was still. The rain on the metal ceiling sounded like gunshots. "I don't see a sign of them in here," Ralph observed. "I was hoping they would have come in here to take shelter on the way to wherever they're headed." I didn't answer. My eyes were acclimating to the dimness. I studied the massive room for a minute or two. "What do you think?" asked Ralph. "I don't think we're going to get anywhere tonight in this rain," I told him. Ralph nodded. He began laying out our sodden sleeping bags. For the first couple hours, I didn't sleep. I gazed at the ceiling and let my mind wander to terrible places where Mateo and Jake were dead or dying in a flooded ravine, screaming for help. I imagined them caught under rocks after a landslide, bodies broken and covered in mud, waiting for wolves or bears to finish them off. When the rain tapered off at 3 a.m., I slept. Again, I felt as if I was being pulled towards Fallenfield Mountain. The pull was soft and seductive, like a lover guiding me by the hand to the bedroom. More droning came through my slumber, not bellowing, but still insistent, like heavy breath in my ear. I thought I heard more whispering in that breath. The voices sounded like Mateo and Jake and Ralph. It was as if they were inviting me to come get them. When I woke at 6:15, Ralph wasn't next to me. His clothes lay crumpled on his sleeping bag across the room. The far window was broken. When I went over to investigate, I saw fresh blood on the glass. I knew whose it was. I realized that all the objectives of my original job had been put on the back burner. I needed to do a number of things. The first was find my colleagues. I didn't know what had happened, but there was no way I'd leave them. Second, and I surprised myself by how far away the second priority was, I had to get myself out of there safely, if only to warn the company not to send others out here. Third, if this could even be considered a possibility, if everything turned out to be a bizarre case of happenstance, the four of us could continue the survey, but that might as well have been a joke. I gathered the minimal supplies I had remaining, and I set off. Right outside the property of the mining facility was the descent into Fallenfield Basin. It wasn't particularly steep, but it wasn't a long way down through the mud and pulverized shards of rock. I guess the best way to describe Fallenfield Mountain is that it's like a castle surrounded by a moat. Luckily for me, there wasn't much water that I'd have to slog through. There was some, though, and it was doubtless more than usual thanks to the rain that we'd had been dealing with. As I trudged ahead, I was greeted by that same droning sound, louder than ever. There was no whispers, though. For that I was thankful. I could attribute the droning to the military base despite it being nowhere near me anymore. The whispers, though, those were the stuff of nightmares. I didn't know what I'd do if I heard those while wide awake. It took 3 hours to get to the bottom of Fallenfield Basin. I'd been forced to change paths multiple times due to flooding and mud that threatened to bury me to my chin. A few times I saw depressions in the mud that could have been the footsteps of my colleagues. They didn't lead anywhere, though, just to more water or mud. For all I knew, I could have passed them without noticing hours ago. It didn't matter. I knew they'd survive. They would have gone toward the mountain. My memories, how I felt when I slept, made me certain they'd experienced the same sensation of being pulled, except in their cases, it seemed like it had been more than just a sensation. It had been a compulsion. Sometime around 10, I reached the base of Fallenfield Mountain. I studied its heavy, forested sides, grateful that I wouldn't have to be climbing up sheer rock faces until much later in the ascent. The wooded climb, while steep, wasn't very difficult. Even my unclothed, supply-lacking colleagues could have done it. Why they would have, however, eluded me and terrified me. 2 hours were spent climbing up the wooded mountainside. The trees grew sparse after that. Sheets of rock replaced forest soil. I started using my climbing axe. I thought to myself, there's no way the three guys could have gotten this far. They simply weren't equipped to handle the climb. A half hour later, as I maneuvered the climbing axe to a fissure in the rock face, I saw a streak of red. I looked closer. A detached finger was sticking out of the crack. A wave of nausea and vertigo rolled through me, and I almost lost my balance. I took a few deep breaths, summoned up my courage. I plucked it out. It wasn't old. It was definitely human. I looked up the slab I was climbing. The red streaks continued onward up the mountain. I shuddered and dropped it. A second later, the sky was split by the loudest droning sound yet. The rocks shook, and I hugged the wall as tightly as possible. It only lasted a few seconds. Every part of me wanted to turn around and go back. I'd get to the bottom, I'd walk all day and night, however long it took to get me back to town. Forget those guys, I kept telling myself. They're the ones who left you, not the other way around. Those are the thoughts that echoed through my consciousness as I climbed. I was on autopilot from that point forward. My mind shouted, "Go back!" while my body pulled itself up Fallenfield Mountain. Now I understand how the others had been compelled. Up and up and up and up I went. My body was baking in the sunlight. It was so unbearably hot, hotter than it should have been, hotter than it could have been. I found myself shucking off articles of clothing every chance I got. Could have been my imagination, but I would have sworn I saw steam coming from cracks and crevices in the rock. There was a point when I knew I had to be near the peak. Fallenfield Mountain was a little more than 4,000 feet high, and when I looked over my shoulder, I knew that I had to be close. I hauled myself onto the edge of an indention in the rock and realized after a moment spent catching my breath and trying to regain a semblance of self-control how deep the indention really was. I'd reached the mouth of a cave. From floor to ceiling, it was probably 50 feet high. I didn't go back particularly far. I could see the rear of it, maybe 100 yards back. I got up, I walked forward. I was wearing nothing but my shoes and underwear, and still I felt like I was boiling in my skin. Another drone shook the mountain. That time I was sure I saw steam oozing from the fissures in the rock. I smelled it too. It was charred, rotting meat. I saw things stuffed inside the rock, dead animals, mostly birds and squirrels in various stages of decomposition. My brain fired its runaway messages over and over and over, but my body simply ignored them. In the distance, dim against the rock at the rear of the cave, I saw 3 shapes. I walked towards them. Before I could make out what they were, I knew who they were. A few seconds later, I was standing in front of the bodies of Raphael, Jake, and Mateo. Their fingers were worn down to bloody nubs. Their toes were almost all gone. Even their teeth were missing, and their gums were frayed all the way to their jawbones. I felt profoundly ill. Another drone. This time it felt deeper and more resonant, and before my eyes a chasm opened in the rock below my 3 colleagues. They dropped inside maybe 2 feet. Steam erupted from below, and the odor of charred flesh filled the cave. I backed up and I clutched the wall to my left. Just for a second, when I felt the rock move against my back, I whirled around, surprised that I had that much control over my body. It was as if whatever had been compelling me had brought me to that one spot and released its hold. I stared at the spot that had moved. 8 shiny black ovals dotted the surface of the granite wall, each about 2 feet high and 1.5 feet wide. They were featureless. The steam from the corpses of my colleagues had gotten thick and choking. It was hard to see what had happened on the ground. I got closer to one of the ovals in my face, only inches away when it moved. The shiny blackness slid apart on either side, a colossal gazing eye staring back at me. In my peripheral vision, I could see that the 7 others had done the same. I screamed and I struck one with my axe. Thick, yellow fluid spurted out onto the floor. The droning sound exploded from all around the cave, and it shook as if an earthquake was tearing it apart. I took off running towards the mouth of the cave. I could see all along the walls more and more eyes were opening. Their vile pupils followed my movement. I struck a few more with my axe as I ran, trying not to fall as the shrieking threatened to hurl me to the ground. In a panic, I looked over my shoulder at the rear of the cave. The entire back portion had fallen away, revealing a cluster of more eyes. 50 feet high, 30 feet wide, they glared as I ran. Around me, more rock faces started to change, not just eyes this time, limbs. They twitched and writhed and seethed and enveloped. How things so large could move with such serpentine agility confounded me, but the confusion only came long after the fact. In the moment, terror was all I felt, detached, otherworldly terror. I reached the ledge that had brought me to the cave. I fully expected that I would jump off and fall and leave my fate to chance. The mountain had changed, however. It was sinking into the ground. The sheer faces I had climbed were now like leathery, pocketed flesh, and they were at an angle that I could run on. My imagination whirled even as I ran. I imagined impossible things chasing me. I imagined the ground lurching and heaving with hideous breaths and grasping limbs, things that couldn't actually be happening, but in my stark horror, I knew they were real. The mountain bellowed what sounded like words and phrases and chants, and I felt my eardrums cracking and fraying. My feet pounded the porous ground as I ran away, hearing over the noise the slithering and hissing fronds of formerly solid rock following after me. I reached the forested side of the mountain, and I fell. I somersaulted. I whirled through the air, striking the ground and trees with such force that I felt bones breaking, but the impact slowed me enough that the subsequent hits weren't strong enough to kill me. I saw nothing but swirling sky and ground, but that drone, that hideous, cacophonous drone, filled my head and embedded itself in my mind, and the last thing I remember was landing in the mud of Fallenfield Basin and staring into the blue, cloudless sky. My world washed away in a sea of blue. I awoke to searing, wrenching pain in my left shoulder and ankle. My eyes opened to an orange late afternoon. I struggled in the mud, the whole event rushing back to me in a series of disjointed flashes. Writhing in the muck like a worm, I found a system of roots that allowed me to roll over and hoist myself up on my one leg that wasn't ruined. I pulled a branch over to me and I put it under my good arm and stared off in disbelief at what was in front of me. Or rather, what wasn't. Fallenfield Mountain was gone. In its place was a gaping hole. Water from the basin oozed into it, falling along its edges, but dropping so far I couldn't hear it land. There were no trees, no rocks. I don't remember how I managed to get back to town or how long it took me. All I knew was a steady, relentless stretch of pain and a sleeplessness. I was found unconscious in a residential driveway on the outskirts of town, and I woke up in a hospital. What turned out to be 2 weeks later. I returned to work a week after that. I expected to be more of a story when the public learned about the disappearance of an entire mountain. Our company did a good job keeping its actual findings quiet, though. Once they debriefed me and sent me back to work at the headquarters, the explanation that everyone ran with was an earthquake caused by experimental fracking technology. The news media loved the opportunity to take on the practices of fossil fuel companies, and the public ate it out of their hands. We took some heavy losses and endured a public relation nightmare, but only I and the upper brass and a few researchers of the company knew the truth. It was a year later, once I'd healed up and the outrage had died down, that I believed I had an emotional fortitude to look into the actual events of those days. I pressed my higher-ups to let me see what I could find. And honestly, it didn't take much pressure. They wanted to know just as badly as I did. The last thing they needed was an incident like what I'd been through. I sat with the researchers and studied the earlier surveys of Fallenfield. Nothing hinted at anything organic lurking under the inside of the mountain. Certainly nothing that could have alluded to what actually happened. Months went by. We were at a loss. All the analysis of Fallenfield came back looking no different than any of the other mountains in the area. It was only when Ingrid, a senior researcher who'd formerly worked for the companies that had owned the old mining facility surrounded by the mountain, remembered that they had conducted studies of the rocks on the outskirts of Fallenfield in the basin. And those rocks, it turned out, were a different composition than those in the rest of the mountain range. They were rich in iron and had hallmarks of things Ingrid called carbonaceous chondrites. When she announced this, I noticed the jaws of some of the other researchers had folded open. I wasn't sure what she meant, so I inquired. Carbonaceous chondrites are a type of meteorite, Ingrid said, her voice slow and thoughtful. It means a large one hit there at some point. It took me a minute, but it all came together after that. See, for so long, we'd wondered why Fallenfield Mountain was at the center of a depression. It didn't make any geological sense, but we just chalked it up to being one of those things. But now it all clicked. Fallenfield Mountain hadn't somehow risen from the center of what we'd call Fallenfield Basin. Fallenfield Basin. It was an impact crater. And the mountain. Well, the mountain had been something else. Entirely. May 9th, 1998. At night, we played poker with Scott, the guard, Elias, and Steve, the researcher. Steve was very lucky, but I think he was cheating. What a scumbag. May 10th, 1998. Today, a high-ranked researcher asked me to take care of a new monster. It's like a gorilla without any skin. They told me to feed them live food. When I threw in a pig, they were playing with it, tearing off the pig's legs and pulling out the guts before they actually ate it. May 11th, 1998. Around 5 o'clock this morning, Scott came in and woke me up suddenly. He was wearing a protective suit that looked like a spacesuit. He told me to put on one as well. I heard there was an accident in the basement lab. It's no wonder those researchers never rest, even at night. May 12th, 1998. I've been wearing this annoying spacesuit since yesterday. My skin's growing musty. It smells very... and feels very itchy. By way of revenge, I didn't feed those dogs today. Now I feel better. May 13th, 1998. I went to the medical room because my back's all swollen and feels, well, itchy. They put a big bandage on my back, and the doctor told me I didn't need to wear the spacesuit anymore. Guess I can sleep well tonight. May 14th, 1998. When I woke up this morning, I found another blister on my foot. It was annoying. I ended up dragging my foot as I went to the dog's pen. They've been quiet since morning, which is very unusual. Found that some of them had escaped, and I'll be in trouble if the higher-ups found out. May 15th, 1998. Even though I didn't feel well, I decided to go see Nancy. It's my first day off in a long time, but I was stopped by a guard on the way out. They say the company's ordered that no one leaves the grounds. Can't even make a phone call. What kind of joke is this? May 16th, 1998. I heard a researcher who tried to escape from this mansion was shot last night. My entire body feels burning and itchy at night. When I was scratching the swelling on my arm, a lump of rotting flesh dropped off. What the hell is happening to me? May 19th, 1998. I heard a researcher who tried to escape from this mansion was shot last night. May 19th, 1998. Fever gone, but itchy. Hungry. Eat doggy food and itchy. Itchy. Scott came. Ugly face, so I killed him. Tasty. Poor. Itchy. Tasty. Having difficulty staying awake there? Trying to study for some big exam, finish some last-minute assignment that you put off all weekend. It's now 3 a.m. and you're absolutely exhausted. Or perhaps you were in a similar state recently and are looking for help on what to do. Well, friend, I have just the prescription to ease your weary mind. All you need to do is win the game. Setting up the game is relatively simple. All you need is an hourglass, a candle, and a marker. Let's make one thing specifically clear. You need an hourglass, not one of those rinky-dink 30-second pieces of shit that you get out of a cereal box or board game. Before playing the game, test your hourglass to make sure that it takes an hour or slightly longer to drain out all the sand from one section to the other. Having it take slightly longer will help, but not too long or too short, or you'll run into complications during the game. You must also be completely alone in the room while playing. When you're ready to play, choose any room that can be sealed, simply meaning that all doors and windows can be closed. Any other form of timekeeping device or alarm must be taken out of the room prior, or the game will not begin. The hourglass will be your only time tracking tool, hence why having an accurate hourglass is important. Anything with an electronic display should be removed. This includes TVs, cell phones, computer monitors, anything. Leaving them in the room during the game will put you at a massive disadvantage. You may begin the game at 8 p.m. Make sure the room is sealed, drawing the curtains to block out any outside light, then draw a simplistic hourglass shape on the back of one of your hands. Make sure to remember well which hand it was, since you'll mostly be in the dark for this game. Take the candle and light it, then turn off the lights and sit down on the floor with the 3 previously mentioned objects close together. And flip the hourglass so the sand begins to fall into an empty half. The only source of light should be your candle. Now yell something along the lines of, "I'm not tired, and I refuse to go to sleep." Close your eyes to count off 10, and open them again. You won't be entirely sure, but somewhere in your room, you'll think you see the shadowy outline of a man. And you've now begun the game. And your opponent is none other than the master of sleep himself, the Sandman. Don't provoke him, and don't speak to him either. You've challenged him, and in a way, insulted him about his profession. So he's not in the best of moods, to say the least. Now comes the game. Your task is to stay awake as long as possible to a maximum of 8 hours, which will take you to 4 a.m. Each hour, you must flip the hourglass to reset it and keep the game going. Each time you flip the hourglass, you may take the marker and draw a tally mark on your arm. The specifics of which arm you mark will be explained later, and don't think you can just flip over the hourglass 8 times really quick or just draw 8 lines in your arm. The hour needs to pass in order for the magic to work. If you fail to flip the hourglass before the last grain of sand falls, or should you succumb to sleep, you'll lose. During this time, the Sandman will be deploying as many tricks as possible to get you to fall asleep or to give in. See, the bottom half of your hourglass at any time represents his power. The more sand in it, the stronger his influence will be. Almost immediately upon starting, you'll begin to feel drowsy. That's merely his presence. Now, if you can't last against this, stop playing. During the first hour, he won't do a lot. He may walk around the room, but he won't touch you or speak to you. Even if you talk to the being, which is something you should really avoid doing, there won't be any response. Also, don't move from your spot to approach him. The closer you get, the more drowsy you'll become. And if you're not near your candle, he may put it out so you can go to sleep. Don't distract yourself during this time. You can easily lose track of time and forget to flip the hourglass over. The Sandman can also skew your perception of how much time has passed, but he can't affect the hourglass, so keeping your focus on that is your best chance of winning. Side note, if you leave the room, you'll find all the doors are locked. And the windows, they'll show nothing but an unyielding darkness as far as you can see. After you pass the first hour, the Sandman may scoff, but will continue to stay in the room. Now he'll begin to pull more from his bag of tricks. He's seen that you're going to be a hard one to put down. The sounds of music boxes and harps may be heard, at first from a distance, but will slowly grow to a level that will be audible. Comforting. Resist the urge to close your eyes and listen. Your body will grow weary as you approach hour 2 or 3, depending on how the Sandman is feeling that night. Around this time, he'll begin speaking to you in many voices. The first voice of a young girl, the wise cracking laugh of a grandparent, or perhaps even ever-loving, recognizable words of your own mother. He'll try to congratulate you on surviving for so long with the Sandman, for braving sleepless days and nights to win this game. Whispers of lullabies and nursery rhymes will fill your head, but you know better. Say nothing, and ignore the voices, no matter how real they may seem. Don't listen to them. Do not go to sleep. If you manage to make it to the halfway point, and now you have 4 marks in your arm, you'll be nothing less than exhausted, and the Sandman will be nothing less than enraged. He'll begin to manipulate your environment even more and start using new tricks to get you to go to sleep. Instead of trying to lull you to sleep, he'll attack you. Hallucinations will occur. You'll see horrifying images of the dead hanging from the ceiling. Flashed by a spotlight of unknown origin, the room will start to close in, then stretch out, then close in again, and stretch back out. A whisper in your ear will turn into shouting in your face from an invisible source. Already weakened and sleep-deprived, your remaining energy will be drained in bursts from the terror. You may have sudden adrenaline rushes, sure, but the Sandman is clever. He'll time them so that you can't just survive in the next hour by simply being anxious. He'll wait until your emotional state has fallen just another level lower, and then BAM! 2 rotted feet dangling in front of your eyes. You can scream all you want. You can beg for him to stop. But this will only use up more of your ability to function. At the 6-hour mark, the hallucinations will shift between horror and comfort, while the Sandman will begin to pick your brain and find what nightmares cause you to come to a cold sweat many a night. Others will coax you towards slumber, claiming that you've put up with enough and that you deserve rest. A warm bed to tuck yourself into, a pillow made from the softest of furs and feathers. The harps and music boxes will start to overload your senses of hearing. In your state, you may welcome the chance to sleep, but snap out of it. Have you been watching the hourglass? Make sure that his terrors aren't distracting you. This is why you don't talk to the Sandman. For every tiny detail about yourself you give, he'll use it against you here. This is also the part where electronic displays can become a massive problem. They'll turn on, regardless of whether they're powered on or not. Should you gaze upon their mystifying image for too long, your eyelids will droop. Your body will collapse onto the floor. If you had just turned the screens away, the Sandman might use some muscle and turn it back towards you, so you can get a better view. The curtains may open to a brilliant dawn, or a clear blue sky, but the only truth in this room are your arms and the hourglass. Unless you have 8 marks, the game isn't over. Use any ounce of strength that you have to flip that hourglass. Now, an immense chore from the Sandman's influence. Scrawl a line on your arm with the marker, even if it looks like you're taking a knife and slashing your own arm open. During the final hour, the Sandman will begin to address you directly, asking you questions that appear to be simple, but as you are, you can't even remember what 2 + 2 equals. The question is the hardest thing to get out of your head. So don't let it get in. Cover your ears. Just watch the hourglass. Keep those eyes open. Don't fall asleep. If the question gets in your head, you'll start thinking about it, adding more stress and draining you of what little mental will you have left. It might become hard to breathe, as if something is squeezing your lungs, or the air is dense and hard to take. The Sandman will also get physical, grabbing you and throwing you across the room, leaving you to crawl back to the hourglass before time is up. If you catch a glimpse of his face, it may be enough of a nightmare to haunt you and keep your eyes from shutting. There'll be no distinguishable facial features, save for 2 bloody eyes, the lids torn from the sockets, endlessly staring. If you can't take it anymore at any point before the 8th hour is completed, take the hourglass and break it with all of your might. Both sections must be broken for the game to end. For your sake, I hope it was made of glass. Anyone who made it to the 7th hour mark has never had the strength to successfully break it, and either carried on or surrendered to their dreams. You'll not receive a reward for ending the game this way, save the mercy of avoiding the Sandman's wrath. If you make it to the end of the 8th hour without falling asleep, though, you won't need to flip the hourglass again. Simply make the 8th mark on your arm and close your eyes. However you ended the game, you can't sleep just yet. There's one final task remaining. All you must do is wait for the Sandman to collect the hourglass and say, "You're all grown up now. Sleep when you wish. Open your eyes. Find that the hourglass is gone and the candle put out. Now you may collapse in slumber. A 12-hour slumber, to be precise. The game puts a heavy strain on your mind and body, so recovery is necessary. But it's the last sleep you'll ever need. Or at least, to that length. Because once you've fully recovered, you'll be able to stay awake for an extra hour for each tally on your marked arm. Depending on your normal sleep schedule, this may mean that you only need a small nap, maybe an hour or two at most, but for some, you'll never have to lie down again. And sure, you'll have the ability to do so if you want to. You can even still dream, but there will never be any weariness following you. Just think about how productive you could be. But it's not all sugar plums and gumdrops. If you mark any tallies on your arm that are not marked by the hourglass, then you'll instead require more sleep. 1 hour for each tally on the blank arm, to be precise. You'll require more rest to be able to even function throughout your day. Now, these marks can cancel with the ones on your marked arm. If that's not the case, you may just have gone through all of that suffering only to come out worse than before. And what with your delirious state throughout the game, it's unlikely for the average individual to come out with all their tallies on the marked arm. There are also the circumstances of losing. If you fail to flip the hourglass, then the Sandman will gain full power, and with a snap of his fingers, you'll collapse on the ground. Regardless of how you fall asleep, be it by failure of the hourglass or succumbing to your own tiredness, you'll also sleep for 12 hours to recover. But it will be the worst sleep that you've ever had. The Sandman will make damn sure of that case. The worst nightmares will flood your mind, leaving you unable to escape or wake up in a relief-filled cold sweat. All you can do is endure the torture of a dream that feels like years in length. And when you finally come to consciousness the next morning, there you'll be, lying on the floor of your room, the mark still on your arm, blood flowing from where your eyelids once rested. You said you refused to close your eyes and go to sleep. So the Sandman granted that wish. Pacific Glade is a quiet town, mostly. That's one of the perks of living so far away from everyone else. It's the kind of place where you let your kids wander long after the sun goes down. Place where you don't mind animals coming out of the forest to nuzzle your heels and beg for scraps. We get next to zero tourism. Some people joke that we should call it the Neverglades. With a blip on the map that you'd never notice unless you were driving through. Old Town could disappear from the face of the earth one day and the rest of the world would never notice our absence. If you spent most of your life here like me, you grow used to its idiosyncrasies. Take the weather. We've had hailstorms in July and hot December nights that make you want to jump headfirst into Lake Lucid. The woods make noises too. Usual hoots and hollers, the usual hoots and hollers, of course, but sometimes when it's late, you hear these strange scraping sounds from the trees that make the fillings in your teeth tingle. And let's not forget that summer where every single chicken in the glade vanished overnight. You never found a trace of those critters, not even a single feather left behind. Par for the course for the average citizen, but when you work here as a homicide detective, you notice other things. Bodies with unexplained wounds and markings, trails that lead nowhere, pieces that don't quite fit together, no matter how much you turn them. Eventually, you have to accept that not all cases can be solved. Now, that's a shitty feeling. But that's reality for you. Some killers never get caught. Some deaths have no satisfying explanation. You take the good cases with the bad and hope you leave the world at least a little better than you found it. The case that changed everything for me started out not different from all the others. I was driving down the highway in my police cruiser, flipping through the radio stations on the dash, when Olivia Marconi's voice came crackling over my walkie-talkie. "You there, Mark?" she said. "We got a suspicious death at the gas station in Minnow Street. This one's got your department written all over it." I brought the walkie up to my mouth. "Be there in a sec," I said. "Try and keep the body warm for me." "Just get over here, asshole." I could usually tell when Marconi was messing with me, but there was no smirk in her voice this time. Didn't bode well. My smile fading, I stepped on the gas and rocketed down the highway towards the center of town. No matter where you go in the glade, drive far enough and you'll find yourself surrounded by trees, and not just any trees. I'm talking a full-blown forest, with twisted branches and canopies that make everything dark as night, even in mid-afternoon. The nearest town is a 20-minute drive through acres of wilderness. I remember growing up and hearing stories from the other kids. The stuff we saw on TV was all propaganda. There was nothing more to the world except an endless forest that branched out in all directions and swallowed up the horizon. Pretty morbid for a bunch of kids. But then again, kids are pretty morbid. I would know. I got 2 of my own. It was getting late when I finally pulled up to the Minnow Street gas station, and in the darkening treetops, flashed with spirals of red and blue, the lot was absolutely packed with cruisers. Parking further down the street, I stepped out of my car and crossed the lot to slip underneath the police tape. Sheriff Marconi was speaking to a boy in a red cashier's vest when I walked in. He couldn't have been more than 16. His skin was slick with sweat, and he wouldn't stop fidgeting. He just kept wringing his hands together, wiping them on the sides of his pants in a constant agitated motion. When Marconi saw me enter, she placed a hand on the boy's shoulder and said something too quiet for me to hear. She left him alone with his private trauma and came over to join me by the door. "Poor kid's scared out of his wits," she said under her breath. "I don't blame him. This one's a doozy, Mark. They even got a federal agent investigating the case." "Seriously?" I asked. "That was fast." I craned my neck, but the shelves were swarming with cops. I couldn't make out any unfamiliar faces. She shrugged. "And must have been somebody in the area already. He got here just a couple minutes after we did." "I'll go see what he's up to," I said. "Maybe he's spotted something our guys have missed." "Be my guest," she grimaced. "But brace yourself, Mark. It's not pretty over there." I tipped her a quick salute and worked my way through the aisles, heading towards the scene of the crime. It wasn't hard to find. Cops were streaming in and out over the shelves, ushering curious spectators away and trying to stifle the overall panic from the other customers. I pushed my way through the mob and found myself staring down at a hopelessly mangled body. There was something unnatural about the way that he was sprawled out on the floor. Something disjointed, almost a little spidery. I recognized the federal agent right away. He would have stood out in any crowd, easily 7 feet tall and slender as a pole. He loomed over the cop like a statue. Everything about him was gray. Fedora, trench coat, even the pallid color of his skin. The smoldering tip of a cigar protruded from his teeth. He turned to face me as I approached. His eyes were a strange shade of purple that I'd never seen before. They seemed to spin under the overhead lights. Hi, I said, holding out my hand. "Detective Mark Hannigan. Nice to meet you." The tall figure stared at my outstretched hand for a few seconds, then shook it.
"The same to you."
His voice had a gravelly quality, like his throat was coated with pebbles. Thin wisps of smoke escaped from his teeth and billowed around the end of his cigar. "What should I call you?" I asked after a few seconds of silence.
"For now, Inspector is fine. But don't mind me. What are your thoughts on our friend here?"
I leaned down and examined the body. The man's face was hanging in flaps, jagged red streaks that had already begun to fester. The stench was something awful. His nose had disintegrated into a mass of gore and bone. The limbs sprawled across the tiles, bent backwards at impossible angles. In a few places, chunks of blood-stained bone jutted through the skin. I'd seen some pretty grisly stuff on the force before, but this took the cake. Bile churned in my throat and I withdrew quickly from the body. Do we have an ID on the Vic yet? I asked.
His license says Edgar Guerrera, although it's hard to tell if he's the man in the picture. His face is too disfigured.
The inspector knelt down and traced the tiles around the body with one bony finger. He drew it back and rubbed his fingers together. A fine stream of shiny powder trickled to the floor. I frowned. That glass?
I think so,
He replied. He rose to his feet and brushed the powder off his coat.
Look at the way the body's slumped. Lacerations, broken bones. It's almost as though he went straight through a windshield.
That's crazy, I said. There's blood everywhere, sure, but no footprints or drag marks. If this was really a car accident, he either staggered in here after the fact or somebody else lugged him here.
Maybe,
The inspector said.
but why go through all the effort? Whoever did this didn't even try to hide the body.
He flicked some ash towards the crime scene. The body was splayed out across the tiles, limbs spread wide like a human starfish, blood glistening in puddles under the sickly fluorescent lights. He was messy and gory, awfully suspicious. Whoever did this wanted the body to be found. What is it? Got a warning? I asked. The inspector gazed down thoughtfully at the body.
It's possible, of course. That's assuming this was murder. That someone left the body here intentionally. If this was just a freak accident, we've got an entirely different situation on our hands. And that worries me.
I'm not sure I follow you, Inspector, I said, but he didn't elaborate. He kept staring down at the body, purple eyes spinning, lost in thought. Shrugging, I took my phone and snapped a few photos, trying to capture the scene from every angle. Marconi and I could get a closer look once I got the pictures back to the headquarters. All the while, the inspector stood utterly still. If it weren't for the curls of steamy breath escaping from around his cigar, I might have mistaken him for a statue after all. Marconi was leaning against her cruiser when I left the store. I watched as she pulled a stick of gum from her pocket and brought it up to her mouth like a cigarette. Marconi had quit smoking a month ago, and had taken up chewing gum as a substitute. I almost never saw her without a wad in her mouth. She said it helped her relax, and who was I to judge? I walked over and joined her by the cruiser. What did the kid tell you? She snapped the gum in the back of her cheek. He was shelving some cereal boxes when he heard this loud crumpling sound, like somebody crushing a really big can of soda. He went over to the next aisle to check it out and found our friend Mr. Guerrera just lying there. Said he screamed for a few seconds before running to the bathroom to puke. His story checks out with a few customers that we could talk to about it. That sounds like it happened in a matter of seconds, I said. But how is that possible? Guy looks like he's been in a car crash. Nobody could get that mangled that quickly, let alone in a fucking gas station. Marconi turned her head and stared at the convenience store doors. The inspector just wandered outside, cigarette tip still smoldering. He shoved his hands in his trench coat pockets and strode off down the sidewalk. His stride was strange. His body didn't rise and fall with each step. It stayed completely level, as if he was gliding along the ground. I watched the steady glow of his cigar as he turned the corner and disappeared from view. What do you think of that guy? Marconi asked. I only talked to him for a few seconds, but he gave me the creeps. Yeah, he's definitely something, I said. I craned my neck, but the inspector was long gone. Never seen anybody quite like him. Not a bad detective, though. Marconi gnawed on her gum for a few pensive seconds. Well, I hope he wraps up this case quick, she said. I'll rest easier when the feds are off our backs. She spat the wad back into her hand and folded it into the empty wrapper. I stood back as she opened the cruiser door and hopped into the driver's seat. Before she left, she rolled down the window and gave me the dimmest of smiles. See you back at the station, she said. Then she revved the engine and rolled backwards out of the parking lot. The coroner's office confirmed what we had already expected. The victim's wounds were consistent with that of a car crash. It wasn't the lacerations or the broken bones that had killed him, it was blunt force trauma to the head. That explained the mangled mess of his nose. What it didn't explain was how a car crash victim had ended up sprawled on the floor of a convenience store, The security footage wasn't much help. It showed Edgar Guerrera entering the store and browsing the shelves, but after a few minutes the camera began to fizzle and grow riddled with static. By the time it came back into focus, Edgar was dead. Sabotage? Had someone messed with the security camera to conceal their involvement in his death? Nothing seemed to make any sense. And trying to find meaning in this case had me working late into the hours of the night. My wife, Ruth, called me a few times to make sure I was okay. I couldn't tell her too much about the case for obvious reasons, but Ruth was perceptive. She'd seen a couple of my cases on the news, and she knew how dark these things could get. I promised her I was fine and that I'd be home within the next few hours. She didn't quite sound convinced, but said that she'd leave dinner in the fridge for whenever I got back. My investigation into the life of Edgar Guerrera brought up zilch. He was working at a car repair workshop down in the Lower Glade, and doubled as a night janitor at Pacific High. He had a wife and 2 daughters, and went to church with his family on Sundays. I couldn't figure out why anybody would want to kill this guy. He was as vanilla as they come. He had no obvious enemies, no one who harbored enough of a grudge to murder him in such a gory and visible way. Unless the inspector was right, and this was somehow a freak accident, which left us where? That line of reasoning made even less sense than the murder theory. By morning, I was a walking headache, and it had only gotten worse when news of another dead body came over the police channel. The officer seemed reluctant to describe the details, which could only mean one thing. This was a gory one. I thought back to the mangled mess of Edgar Guerrero's body. I wondered what kind of fresh horror they'd stumbled upon this time. There's no point in putting it off until later. Grabbing my jacket, I headed out the door and climbed into my cruiser. The body had been found on the front porch of a house in the Lower Glade, down by Spokane Falls. Few details I could get over the radio were maddeningly vague. All I gathered was that the victim was young and female. However she had died, it was too gruesome to announce over the airwaves. I stepped on the gas and urged my car to go a little faster. The victim's house was a pretty little number, white fences, low-hanging eaves, a front yard laden with flowers of all colors. The falls crashed like pistons in the background. I drove up the driveway, talked for a bit with the officer on duty, and then got out of my car to investigate the scene. I pulled on a set of latex gloves as I did so. A pair of cops were standing together and muttering to one another by the front porch. They stepped aside, warily, to let me through. The porch reeked of rotten body smell, and I had to hold a hand over my mouth and nose before I dared to get any closer. The victim was a blonde-haired girl in her late 20s or so. The entire left side of her body had collapsed into a splattery mess of gore that spread outward in all directions. One green eye still stared blankly into the distance. I knelt down, observing the splintery remains of her limbs for anything out of the ordinary. It was difficult. My eyes were swimming, and I had to fight back the urge to retch. When I looked up again, the inspector was slouched in the doorway. His fedora was pulled low, and his face was framed in a halo of smoke. That damn cigar again. It was like an extension of his body. I almost couldn't imagine him without it. "Did the feds send you down here?" I asked. "They can't possibly think there's a link between these cases, aside from their sheer weirdness."
"I go where I'm needed. Right now I'm needed here."
Didn't sound like he was going to offer anything more, so I stood up and began peeling off my latex gloves. The officer who got here first said her name was Vivian Tracy. A couple of them actually knew her from around town. She volunteered downtown at the soup kitchen and ran a reading group at the public library. It's a bright kid. Her neighbor was the one to phone us about the body. She said she was walking home from the supermarket and just saw Vivian lying there. She didn't get close enough to see the gorier details, but it sounded like she saw enough. The inspector nodded.
"We know anything about the neighbor?"
"Not much. She's getting on in years. She likes walking to the store to get some exercise in her routine. Apparently, she didn't know Vivian all that well, but she said that she seemed like a nice enough girl. Not the kind of person someone would want to murder."
"Just like Mr. Guerrera,"
the inspector said quietly. Sounded like he'd done some research of his own. I cast another glance at the body. "If this even was murder," I said. I'd seen suicides leap from buildings before. I'd watched medics scrape viscera off the sidewalk. There was no doubt in my mind that Vivian Tracy had fallen to her death, but how was that possible? The porch roof overhead was still intact. She obviously hadn't come crashing through it. And there was no way our would-be murderer could have dragged the body here. The splatter made it all too clear that this was the point of impact. "What the hell's going on here?" I muttered. The inspector leaned down and tilted what remained of Vivian's arm with one hand. Her skin was streaked with blotchy green patches. It reminded me of the grass stains my son got on their knees after soccer practice. "Is this significant?" I asked him.
"Everything's significant," he replied, straightening up. "You should know that by now."
Steam trailed from his cigar in slow, almost thoughtful spirals. My head was starting to throb again, and the insistent crashing of Spokane Falls wasn't doing much to help. I rubbed my aching temple. It had been a long day and a half. Maybe things would start making sense if I went home and recharged my batteries. It was around 3 a.m. when the cell phone on my dresser began to buzz. I've always been a light sleeper, which is lucky for a detective. You never know when you need to be on your feet in a hurry. I fumbled for the phone and brought it up to my ear. "Detective Hannigan," I said, keeping my voice to a whisper. Ruth was fast asleep next to me and I didn't want to wake her up.
"It's me,"
said the voice on the other end of the line. The inspector. The connection didn't muffle his voice, which created this unsettling illusion that he was crouching by my bedside, speaking directly into my ear. I rubbed my eyes and peered around the bedroom just to be on the safe side. "How'd you get this number?" I mumbled. The inspector either didn't hear me or chose not to answer.
"I've been doing research down at the station, and I may have picked up a lead on the Tracy Guerrera deaths. Can you head to the Suquamish Bluff area and do some recon?"
I squinted at the clock on my desk. "I'm officially off duty, Inspector. Are you sure you can't ask one of the other officers? I'm pretty sure Marconi's out patrolling right now."
"No, it needs to be you, Mark. Call me when you're on the road, and I'll give you the specifics."
"Hang on, Damn it." The man didn't leave much room for conversation. I stared at the glowing screen on my phone for a few seconds before sighing and placing it down again. Ruth's eyes were open when I turned to get out of bed. They glittered a little in the light from the window. "Duty calls?" she asked. She drew back the covers a few inches and began to knead the fabric with her right hand. The moon dappled her bare skin with shadows of leafy branches. I leaned over and kissed her gently on the forehead. "I won't be gone long. I promise." She surveyed me, silent, her eyes refusing to give away that she was thinking. "Just stay safe," she said at last. I told her I would, and I slipped out of bed. Grabbing my jacket from the bedpost and tripping hastily into a pair of work boots. I called the inspector as I headed outside and fumbled through my jacket pockets for the keys to my Camaro. "Okay, I'm here," I said. "Tell me what you got."
"Both victims had ties to a high school teacher named Elroy Pickett," he replied in that strangely crisp voice. I glanced around again before slipping into the driver's seat. "He's a botanist. Teaches environmental science at the school where Edgar did his janitorial work. He's also a head volunteer at the youth group Vivian Tracy attended up until her death."
I paused, waiting for more. "That's it?" I asked. "You got me out of bed for a connection this flimsy? I'm sorry, Inspector, but there's nothing to even remotely suggest that this is a lead. People know other people. It's not so unusual for both Vics to have mutual friends in a town this size." The inspector let out an exasperated noise that I could only describe as a hiss.
"But that's the thing," he said. "They don't have anyone in common. I checked as many sources as I could, and as far as I can tell, Elroy is the only link between our victims. Plus, Elroy himself seems to have dropped off the radar. He hasn't shown up at school for the past week, and nobody has seen him around town since then. He's holed up in his house doing God knows what. That's why I want you to do a little snooping, scope out his home, and see if he's up to anything suspicious." I sighed. "Fine, I'll humor you on this one, but you'd better be on to something here."
The voice at the other end of the line was quiet for a few moments.
I don't know if you believe in intuition, Mark, but every nerve in my body went on edge when that man's name came up on the database. One way or another, he's involved with this, and I intend to find out how.
He gave me Elroy's address and hung up before I could get another word in. A real talker, that one. I shook my head, turned the wheel, and headed down the back roads that would take me all the way to Skokomish Bluffs. When I was a kid, the Bluffs had a reputation of being haunted. Indian burial grounds and such, you know how it is. But mostly the Bluffs were just quiet. We almost never had disturbances this far out of town. The few people who lived out here kept to themselves, and so did the animals who poked their heads out of the forest from time to time. This was off near the edge of the glades. You couldn't walk 10 feet without stumbling into a line of trees. The view from the top of the bluffs was stunning. During my younger years, I used to come up here with my friends and watch the setting sun sink behind the line of treetops. It made the entire forest look like it had gone up into flames. I drove through a couple of acres of wilderness before the ground sloped upwards and the trees gave way to a grassy emptiness. The road beneath my tires was more dirt than pavement. From time to time, the occasional house would rise from the landscape and flit past my side window. Most of them had seen better days. Grimy, warped wood that glistened in the moonlight, and shutters hanging askew. That sort of stuff. A few lone cattle drifted through the fields, nibbling aimlessly at the grass. It wasn't hard to find Elroy's house. The place was in much better shape than the houses I had seen before, and there was a massive greenhouse sprouting from the back that seemed to teeter on the edge of the bluffs. Hadn't the inspector said Elroy was a botanist? I parked my car in a nearby thicket and cut the engine. My headlights faded. Then I settled back into the driver's seat and waited. What was I waiting for? I had no clue. The likelihood that Elroy would be awake at this hour, let alone doing anything suspicious, was close to nil. But the inspector had been insistent on me coming here, so I figured I owed him the benefit of the doubt. I kicked my feet up on the dashboard and stared at the empty windows, watching for any signs of movement. Around 4:15, the front door opened suddenly and I froze where I was sitting. An elderly man with feathery white hair came limping onto the front porch. Elroy? He looked older than I had expected. I followed him as he hobbled over to the porch swing and eased into it with a visible wheeze of breath. I sank deeper into my seat and dialed the inspector on my cell phone.
Anything?
He asked right away. I'm at Elroy's house and he's just walked onto the front porch, I said under my breath. A little late for him to be out, don't you think? Especially someone his age. I could practically see the inspector wrinkling his brow.
His age? What do you mean?
I mean, he's seriously old. Old enough to be my grandfather. I don't know, Inspector. Seems like you might have made the wrong call on this one. There was a sharp intake of breath from the other side of the line.
Don't go anywhere near him,
the inspector said. His voice, usually so collected, now bordered on frantic.
Shit. This is bad. You need to get back to the station now.
I peered through the front window again. Elroy was drifting lazily on the porch swing, hair flowing around his head like wisps of white cotton candy. He's an old man, Inspector. He practically had a heart attack just walking across the porch. How could he possibly be dangerous?
That's no old man,
the inspector insisted. Trust me. If that thing gets its hands on you, it's all over. You need to get out of there. Elroy jerked his head up suddenly, as if he could hear the inspector's voice from all the way across the lawn. His swing froze in place. I tried to crouch behind the dashboard as his eyes darted back and forth. I didn't think you could see my car from here, but those eyes seemed remarkably sharp for someone his age, and I couldn't shake the sense that they could see in the darkness. They reminded me of the time I'd taken a hiking trip with my friends up in Catamount State Forest. We'd seen an actual cougar prowling the rocks on the cliff over from ours. Its eyes glowed yellow in the light from the moon. If it could leap the gap and devour us, I'm sure it would have. And that was a look that I saw in Elroy's eyes. A kind of animalistic hunger. I'll meet you back at the station, I whispered into the phone. Elroy sat there for a few more minutes, peering into the night before he pried himself from the porch swing and shuffled back into the house. I didn't waste any time getting out of there. I started the engines as quickly as I could and I pulled away from the thicket, leaving trails of trampled leaves behind me. Before long, I was out of the bluffs and zooming down the street towards the police station. The trees loomed like sentinels around me, and for the first time in a very long time, I was thankful for the cover. The inspector was waiting by my desk when I finally got back to the station. He had a stack of papers in his hand that he kept flipping through. "The hell's all that?" I asked. He glanced up, startled as if he hadn't heard me come in.
"I've been looking through my research and I found a disturbing link between the victims," he said.
He handed me the papers and stabbed at the first source so hard his finger almost poked through it.
"Look at this article. Edgar Guerrero was involved in a car accident 8 years ago that nearly killed him. It was a 4-car pileup. The paper says that he would have gone through the windshield on impact if he hadn't been wearing his seatbelt. And look at this." He shifted the papers and showed me a grayscale printout. It's a blog post from Vivian Tracy. Apparently, she was skydiving with her college roommate last summer when she had a close call with a ripcord. Her parachute almost didn't open. A few more seconds, and she would have hit the ground full force.
I glanced at the inspector's sources. The newspaper didn't say much about Edgar's car crash, but the vehicles in the picture had crumpled like used soda cans. I had a hard time imagining anyone walking away from this one. The post from Vivian's blog was cheery and riddled with emoticons. There was a photograph of her plummeting through the air, laughing, with a stretch of grassy ground waiting far below to meet her. The girl in this picture had no idea how close she would have come to dying. I thought of her body, spattered in a puddle on the front porch, and an upsetting tingle crawled over my skin. This can't be coincidental, I agreed, handing back the files, but what did these sources have to do with Elroy Pickett? The inspector reached for the desk and withdrew another sheet of printed paper.
"This is a license renewal issued to Mr. Pickett just last year."
He passed it to me. His fingers taut. The license was newly issued, just as the inspector had said, but the figure in the photo was far too young to be Elroy. It's not to say there wasn't a resemblance. His nose had the same crooked bend to it, and his stringy black hair was already starting to thin. I could imagine it growing white and wispy in several years' time. "This guy's only 40 years old," I said, looking up from the paper. "The old man I saw on Elroy's porch must have been his father or something. There's no way a person could age that much in the course of 1 year." The inspector snapped his fingers.
"But that's just it. Elroy has aged, several decades in a matter of months. I know what we're dealing with the second you described him to me. There's something inside him. Something that's been eating away his years until he became that dried up old husk that you saw."
I furrowed my brow. "You want to run that by me again?" The inspector began to pace in agitated circles.
"You don't have a word for what this thing is. Let's call it a time eater. It messes around in the past, turning these people's near-death experiences into real death experiences."
Whoa. Slow down, I said. "What are you saying?" The inspector stopped his pacing.
"This entity doesn't perceive time the same way you do. Not a linear progression. It's like a piece of lattice work. A series of avenues that go forward and backward and sideways in all directions."
He tried to gesture with his hands, but gave up.
"This thing is reaching back in time and tweaking little details. An unbuckled seatbelt, a faulty parachute cord, so that our victims die years before they should have. The past tries to catch up to the present and wham! Instant death. The Time Eater takes these missing years and feeds on them. That's how it stays alive. It's like a parasite, leeching the life force out of others."
"Okay, hold up," I said. "I don't quite understand what you're talking about, but do you hear how crazy you sound? I agree that whatever's happening here is weird, but you can't just go around inventing monsters that fill in all the blanks. There's a perfectly rational answer to all of this. We'll find it. Just give us time."
"We don't have time. Didn't you hear? This thing feeds on time. Every second we waste is another second it could be stalking its next prey.
He rubbed his cheek hastily. Clouds of dense smoke billowed from his mouth.
I know you don't believe me yet, but this is your answer, Mark, so grab your car and let's go. We need to stop Elroy before he feeds again.
He slammed the papers onto my desk and strode to the door, his trench coat whipping behind him. I glanced down at the wrinkled stack of files. Elroy's impassive face stared back up at me. I wasn't ready to buy into the inspector's time eater theory just yet. But what was it Sherlock Holmes said once? When you've eliminated the impossible, whatever remains, however improbable, must be the truth. Elroy Pickett may not have been a time-eating monster from outer space, but he was a common link in both our mysterious death cases, and he may have played some sort of role in the murders. It was worth a look, at least. I must be insane, I mumbled to myself, but I followed the inspector out of the station, making sure to turn off the lights behind me. Marconi wasn't too happy to leave her patrol at this hour of the night, but I told her that we had a lead on the mysterious deaths, however tenuous, and the inspector had requested backup just in case. I trusted Marconi. She was a hell of a shot, and she excelled under pressure. I'd witnessed her handle bomb threats and lines of incessant gunfire without breaking a sweat. It wouldn't be an exaggeration to say that she'd saved my life a few times over. There was no one I wanted more on the force to watch our backs. She met us in the heart of Skokomish Bluffs. Her headlights off, her engine reduced to a low thrum. It wasn't an unusual sound to hear this far into the wilderness. It could have easily been the purr of a mountain cat. Elroy's house waited for us at the top of the bluffs, tiny as an architect's model from where we were standing. The dim moonlight glimmered off his greenhouse. Marconi glanced up at it, then back at us. You boys want to tell me what you're doing in the ass crack of nowhere? She asked.
Just stay here and keep an eye on the place,
the inspector said.
If you hear any sort of commotion, grab your gun and follow us immediately. Don't hesitate to shoot if necessary.
Sorry to drag you into this, I said, putting one hand on the roof of the cruiser. It should be a simple Q&A, but the inspector is getting kind of paranoid, you know, given how extreme these cases have gotten. The bluffs were quiet for a moment. An owl hooted in some distant trees. I seriously appreciate you coming out here, you know. All right, but you owe me, she replied. The smile that flickered on her face was almost a smirk, but it settled into something softer. I gave her a weak salute and turned to join the inspector. We kept to the shadows as we ascended the hill towards Elroy's house.
Keep your gun ready,
the inspector said under his breath. I hesitated. This was supposed to be a peaceful investigation, but he sounded so earnest that I slipped my pistol out of its holster. I gripped it with both hands, the metal cold under my fingers. It felt heavier than usual. Maybe there was something in the air out here. The building couldn't have been more than one story, but it loomed over us as we approached. We climbed onto the front porch with hesitant footsteps. A gust of wind picked up, causing the porch swing to drift lazily back and forth. I reached out to ring the doorbell, but the inspector stopped my hand. The front door was open just a crack, revealing a dark foyer, the welcome mat, and a dried potted plant. He gestured for us to go inside. We don't have a warrant, I hissed. Are you crazy?
Trust me. A warrant is the least of our worries,
he replied. He ducked his head and slipped across the threshold. Swearing under my breath, I held up my gun and followed him into the dark entry hall. I nearly stumbled over another flower pot in the process. They were strewn everywhere along the rug, roots upended, dirt spilling out in clumps. The inspector reached down and picked up one of the fallen leaves. It was gray and crispy, and it crumbled into dust at his touch.
The time eater's been feeding,
he said quietly.
It must have sucked all the juice out of Elroy's plants before moving on to humans. And even that's not enough. Its vessel is aging faster than it can feed.
If you're done speaking gibberish, can we move on here? I whispered. Jesus, this was so illegal in so many ways. Elroy could sue the shit out of us for entering his house without a warrant. I wasn't exactly sure what the inspector was trying to accomplish here. A ceramic clatter issued from the back of the house, and the inspector froze.
The greenhouse,
he said. He rose from his crouched position and darted through the doorway. His slender body disappeared into the darkness of the next room. I gritted my teeth and raced after him. The kitchen was already empty when I stepped inside. Where the hell had he run off to? Another clatter came from deeper in the house, louder this time. It sounded like someone had thrown a flower pot onto the ground. I dodged past the kitchen table, overflowing with empty plates and silverware, before ducking into a side hallway and heading towards the greenhouse. The door had already been thrown open for me, so I hurtled inside. Everything had an eerie silver tint in the moonlight. Plots of earth stood on raised platforms. Dried ferns and withered flowers slumped in piles on the soil. Flower pots were perched on every spare inch of shelf space. I spun in a slow circle, keeping my gun held up, eyes peeled for any signs of movement. I couldn't tell where the crash had come from. There was no ceramic littering the ground, no splinter of roots and dirt. My shoes made light tapping noises on the linoleum as I made my cautious way to the back of the greenhouse. Then a hunched shape came lurching at me from behind one of the raised platforms, fingers bared like claws. Elroy? His head was thrown back, and his wispy hair fluttered behind him as he ran. A guttural cry rose from his throat and pierced my ears. Without thinking, I raised my gun and fired off a single shot. Elroy veered out of the way with almost inhuman agility, moving far faster than any man his age should be able to. Then he crashed into me, knocking me against a glass cabinet and latching onto my arm with one clawed fist. I cried out, my gun flew from my hand and skittered away across the greenhouse floor. Veins popped under his grip, glowing in lines of neon red beneath my skin, the same red glow pulsing from his open mouth. At first, I thought his teeth were missing, but no, it was more than that. The space between his jaw had been completely hollowed out. No gums, no tongue, no esophagus, just a gaping maw where his mouth should have been. I kicked at his shins and tried to struggle free, but his grip was stronger than I would have expected from an old man, if he even was an old man anymore. His eyes had taken on an odd silver sheen, like he was wearing mirrored contact lenses. A tangled sort of snarl escaped from the void that was his throat. His grip tightened, and suddenly my brain was flooded with images. At first, they were just flashes, memories that zipped past me, and with a crackle and a burst of static, but eventually they took on a shuddering sense of coercion, like a film reel spinning. I recognized this night. It must have been 3 years ago, when I was still new to the force. I saw myself crouched down at my police cruiser, gun clenched in one sweaty hand, listening as bullets whizzed past the car and shattered somebody's windshield. Red and blue lights spun in circles around me, and the firing stopped. I lunged up and aimed my gun at the shooter, shouting orders to surrender. The bullet caught me in the chest before I could even finish speaking. It knocked the wind out of me. It sent me sprawling on my back. If it hadn't been for the Kevlar vest that I was wearing, I would have died that night. The bullet had stopped just inches from my heart. Except this memory was different. As Elroy squeezed my arm, the Kevlar began to disintegrate beneath my uniform, shriveling away as if it had never been there in the first place. Maybe it hadn't. This was my missing seatbelt, my faulty ripcord. Elroy was erasing the safety blanket from my past. As the Kevlar shrank away, I could feel the bullet resuming its suspended course, burrowing through my shirt and sinking its cold metal body into the flesh above my heart. And then the inspector burst out of nowhere, barreled into the old man and sent him crashing to the floor of the greenhouse. His fingers detached from my skin with a strange, wet, sucking sound. The memory of my night in the crossfire jerked backwards like the sensation of an elastic snapping, and I collapsed against the glass cabinet. It came crashing down into the pots of dead flowers. I drew in a shuddering gasp of air and tried to regain my balance. The memory of the bullet still burned against my chest, but my shirt was dry. I didn't think it had pierced the skin. Could have been a bit woozy from Elroy messing with my mind. But I staggered to my feet. I thought I saw the old man pick up the inspector and hurl him through the back wall of the greenhouse. His body smashed through with enough force to make the glass explode outward in a shower of tiny shards. Elroy leapt through the gaping hole and threw himself on the top of the inspector. I got down on my knees and began scrambling through the mass of soil and broken glass, searching for my fallen gun. My vision was swimmy, and I had to stop a few times to keep myself from keeling over out of dizziness, but I kept moving. I'd seen what Elroy, or the thing inside Elroy, was capable of. I had to stop him before he got his hands on the inspector, too. At last, my fingers closed around a familiar metal handle, and I got shakily to my feet, gun in hand. I stumbled through the jagged hole and back into the fray. The stretch of grass between the greenhouse couldn't have been longer than 20 or 30 feet. Beyond that was a dizzying drop into the wilderness. The inspector grappled with Elroy, cigar still clenched between his teeth. The smoke that billowed from his lips had turned a dusty shade of red as they fought, and they staggered farther and farther backwards in an effort to drive the other one over the edge. Elroy scrambled at the inspector's arm, trying to sink his claws in and start the whole time-eating process all over again, but as strong as he was, the inspector was stronger. He moved too fast for my delirious eyes to follow, his trench coat whipping behind him like the wings of some avenging angel. I aimed my pistol at the pair of the struggling figures, but I couldn't get a lock on Elroy in my current condition, as I was too afraid that I would take out the inspector by mistake. Blood pumped in my ears. I'd been in plenty of scrapes during my time on the force, but never had I felt so helpless. The inspector managed to thrust Elroy away from him for a few seconds so that the old man stumbled back onto the lip of the cliff, his arms swinged in a pinwheel. I pointed my gun at him, trying to squeeze out a bullet before the creature could get his balance again. But it was too late. His jaw unhinged, and he was lunging at the inspector, eyes gleaming, claws extended. Bang! Bang! Elroy staggered backwards. 2 fleshy red holes appeared in his chest. Silver goo dripped from the wounds and into the knee-high grass. I turned to see Marconi advancing on the old man, her gun drawn. Elroy bellowed at her, the throaty, tortured yell of an angry animal. She fired again, and again, each shot driving him back just a little further until finally he stepped backwards and slipped off the edge of the cliff. His scream was shrill. It made my eardrums bleed. It lowered in volume as he plummeted towards the forest floor, then cut off suddenly in a choked cry of agony. The ground gave the slightest of trembles, and then in a breathy sigh, escaped into the night, as if the earth itself had let out one loud, miserable gasp of breath. I got unsteadily to my feet and limped across the yard towards Marconi. I'd seen her take down guys twice her size without flinching, but when she lowered her gun, her hands were visibly shaking. "What the hell was that, Hannigan?" she shouted.
The investigation was a bust,
the inspector replied. I jumped. I'd been so focused on reaching Marconi that I hadn't heard him approach.
Mr. Pickett resisted our questioning and became violent, and was unfortunately killed when he tried to assault Detective Hannigan. It's unlikely he had anything to do with the recent deaths. We should return to the station and go back to the drawing board on this one.
Marconi frowned at him. I knew she wouldn't buy it. Marconi was a massive skeptic, but she also believed in her own eyes. She'd seen the thing Elroy had become. There was no way she could have missed that guttural scream. It still hung in the air like the static that pricks up the hairs on your arm right before a thunderstorm. "Okay, fine," she said at last. She glanced between the two of us. Her eyes narrowed. "I'll play along for now, but someday, Hannigan, you are going to tell me exactly what the fuck happened tonight." I lifted my hand to my ear and felt a damp spot just below the earlobe. I drew back my bloody hand and stared at it for a few minutes. Then I looked up at the inspector, the face hidden beneath this fog from his cigar smoke. It was dark and unreadable. "Yeah, I like to know that too." The next evening, I was driving through a dense patch of forest on my way to patrol in the lower glade. It had rained that night. Clouds of mist billowed up from the road and swept over my cruiser. Looking for all the world like a wave of swampy spirits, I turned on my high beams and gave the windshield a few wipes to clear away the drizzle. A particularly dense cloud washed over my car, and when it cleared, the inspector was waiting for me on the edge of the forest. I almost drove right past him. Slamming my foot on the brakes, I yanked the wheel to the right, tires splashing through the puddles that lined the uneven stretch of street. I climbed out of the cruiser and stood across from him. Light raindrops still pattered on the roof of my car. Neither of us spoke for some time. His fedora was low enough to his eyes, and the tip of his cigar still smoldered even in this damp weather. "So you're going to tell me what actually happened last night?" I asked. The inspector blew out a single smoke ring.
"I need to show you something,"
he replied. And then the inspector wavered. Not sure how else to describe it. Nothing about this outward appearance changed, but but it looked as if his body had been hollowed out, like a doll or a puppet. There was something much larger encompassing it, something unseen, pulling the strings. The illusion, whatever it was, lasted no more than a few seconds. He was just the inspector again. Tendrils of steam escaping his cigar and mingled with the misty air. "You're not human," I said. The words felt strange coming out of my mouth. They also felt right. "You're like that thing we fought up in Swicomish Bluffs."
"I'm not a parasite,"
he replied. He didn't sound offended. Just a bit sad. I could have tried to argue with him, with the rational side of me, but knew that he'd be lying. But Sherlock Holmes was right. I glimpsed the improbable that night on the bluffs, and it may have thrown askew everything I thought I knew about the world, but it was true. There's no point trying to deny what my own eyes had seen. Did that scare me? Of course it did. Foundations of my reality were going shaky. Part of me was still clamoring for that one sane foothold, but sometimes rationality can only take you so far. "Why do all this?" I asked him. "We must be, I don't know, like animals to you, or talkative bacteria. Why bother going through all this effort to help us?" The inspector looked away from me, his hidden eyes staring off into the mist. The tip of Mount Palmer floated in the midst of all of it, crags piercing the clouds. Could have been some eldritch beast loping through the fog.
"Reality. All the stuff you see around you and all the stuff you don't is huge. There are beings out there with shapes and sizes you couldn't even begin to fathom, and those with any sort of sentience look down on you people like protozoa. You're specks in a petri dish, bits of dim light that aren't worth the effort to snuff."
He looked down at his hands and flexed his slender fingers as if he was still unused to them.
"Not to me," he said. "I look at humans and see honor, love, loyalty. So strong you would take a bullet for those ones you trust. Archaic values to some of my kind. But I think they're worth protecting. Maybe that's naive of me, but I don't think so."
He took the cigar from his mouth and tapped it against the side of his trench coat. Flecks of ash trickled from the tip and vanished into the soggy ground.
"So in some ways you're right,"
he said.
"You're small, but you're not insignificant. Don't ever forget that."
The sound of his voice gave way to crickets, the ever-present rustling of the trees. I stared up again at Mount Palmer, thinking of the odd weather patterns, the missing chickens, the noises in the woods, the countless unsolved cases we had buried back at the station. "It's the Neverglades, isn't it?" I said. "Something about this place, something that brings all the strangeness to the surface." He pondered the question for a moment.
"In most parts of the world, beings like me keep to ourselves. We stay behind the veil. Don't bother getting involved with humans, but the veil is thin here. There's a rip in reality, if you will. And sometimes, things like Elroy slip through, mindless, hungry things."
"And if more of them get through?" I asked, turning to him. "How do I know you got my back?" The inspector smiled. He may not have been one of us, but that one gesture seemed so genuine, so human, that I half wondered if I was rubbing off on him.
"I told you before. I go where I'm needed. When the time comes, you'll know exactly where to find me."
He tipped his hat to me. drops of rain rolling down the brim. And he took a step backward into the forest. The trees shifted around him, their branches sweeping in like leafy arms to enfold his silhouette. I watched as his body shrank away and became one with the darkness. So there was nothing left of the inspector but the glowing tip of his cigar. It pulsed, like a tiny firefly bobbing its way through the trees. Then the mist settled in around me, cold and heavy. And I found myself alone on that barren stretch of highway. The internet is the most powerful informational tool the world has ever known. A font of knowledge that would have had the Renaissance thinkers green with envy. But there are things out there beyond the limits of our knowledge. Things we really don't want to know. Last night, I found one. I absolutely adore cooking. It's where art and science intersect, a perfect union of creativity and tradition that I find intensely rewarding. Naturally, I look to YouTube and its hundreds of cooking channels for both inspiration and insight. One channel is run by an Asian chef who's based in mainland China. None of the videos are in English, and the entirety of the text is in Chinese. But the language of cooking transcends all, and his videos are easy to follow, thanks to the visual demonstrations. The most popular videos are of pretty staple Chinese cuisine. Fried rice and dumplings, just to name a few. But as I dive deeper, I found the dishes to be more outlandish and, quite frankly, shocking. One video was him playing with a bamboo rat. Some rodents resembling a guinea pig, but furry and cute nonetheless. The chef was feeding peanuts to it, lavishing the little critter with affection, yet, to my absolute horror, the next scene showed him snapping the thing's neck as it screeched in distress. A few scenes of snap editing showed him butchering the thing before seasoning and cooking the meat. Now, I was disturbed, but who am I to cast judgment just because of a few traditional, albeit unusual, delicacies? Then my eyes locked onto thumbnails depicting the smiling chef holding what I assumed to be organ meats. Dark, gelatinous masses of gore that he sliced up and deep-fried. My curiosity piqued, yet without any English captions or descriptions. There was no way of me knowing what those meats were. I resumed scrolling, only to be greeted by a thumbnail that sent my stomach into knots. It was a human foot, cradled next to the chef's ever-smiling face. I watched, horrified, as he stripped away the meat around the long, thin bones before shallow frying it. Fake. It has to be fake, I thought to myself. The next video made me gasp in terror. A woman, bound in a dark cellar, completely shaven, with her eyes plucked out. The chef took out a hatchet, and I watched her body grow limp as he separated her head from her shoulders. The head was then slowly roasted until it browned. I vomited into a nearby trash can. I reported the channel, and it's now been taken down. Hopefully, pending a criminal investigation. But this morning I found a note on my front door. On it was a single character. I had to know what it said. I took it to someone I knew who could be able to translate it for me. I asked the guy, and he looked at me with these nervous eyes. Meat
My name is Lily Madwhip, and I see things before they happen.
Don't stare at me, ass face.
That's my brother, Roger. He doesn't see things before they happen. I know this because if he did, he would see what's about to happen to him. Then again, maybe he does. But people like us can't see things that are about to happen to ourselves. I don't know, truthfully. All I know is that in about 3 minutes, Roger is going to die. You're going to die, I tell him.
Did you just threaten me?
He snarls. Roger is 6 years older than me. He goes to high school and has 2 best friends named Skeeter and Dustin. They like to wear shirts without sleeves that have the names of heavy metal bands on them. And sometimes they hang out in the garage and try to play music like those bands until my dad goes out and yells at them to stop. At his funeral, they're going to wear jackets and ties, and their hair is going to be combed for once. And I'll never see them after that. Which is nice. I love Roger because he's my brother. But when he's gone, things will be just a little bit nicer. Sorry, Roger. No, I told him truthfully. I'm just trying to warn you. I love you, Roger.
Shut up, weirdo.
He punches me in the shoulder and I cry like I'm supposed to, but it doesn't really hurt. Mom's head swivels around her neck from the front of the car and gives us both that look that says she regrets having us. I know she doesn't, but all parents think that from time to time. I wonder where I'd be right now if I'd never had kids. No, I'm not a mind reader too. I just know these things. Will you two knock it off back there? Mom asks. It's not really a question, though. It's an order. Adults can give orders in the form of questions. If you're a kid and you try to do this, it doesn't work. I once tried to order Roger to give me back my doll Pasher by asking him, and he laughed at me and twisted Pasher's head off. Mom had to sew it back on. But she's never been one for sewing, so it's kinda crooked now. I told her I didn't mind. It gives him personality. Mom and Dad think it's weird that I named my doll Pasher. I don't know why. Pasher was an angel after all. People don't think it's weird if you name your doll Gabriel or Michael or Layla. But give it the name Uriel or Gavriel or Pashur, and everybody gives you funny looks. I hug Pasher in my arms and look out the front of the car. There's a sign that says, Rest Area 1 mile, and beneath it, a smaller sign that says, Next Rest Area 46 miles. At the speed my dad drives, that should take us about half an hour, I think.
Rest area coming up. Does anybody need to go?
We stopped hours back at McDonald's, and I had a cheeseburger with some fries and a small Sprite. I couldn't finish the burger or fries, but the Sprite made my tummy happy because sometimes I get a little car sick, so I drank the entire thing. Now, I need to go, but this is where Roger dies. So I lie. I don't. Thinking about having to go makes it worse. I cross my legs. Roger notices.
Lily has to go. She's squirming around back here. I don't want her pissing on me.
He makes a grossed out face, and I can appreciate the genuine disgust of being peed on by someone else. But Roger, I'm trying to save your life here. Mom looks back again, and I shake my head at her. Lily, if you have to go... I don't.
She does, and I do too.
I don't think Roger actually has to go. Dad turns onto the ramp for the rest stop, ending the conversation. There's 2 lanes, one for the big trucks and one for the little cars. Our station wagon takes the second lane and wraps back around to go up a hill to the parking lot for the rest area. There's some sort of big rock on a pedestal with a commemorative plaque at the base with lots of names of people who are dead. Other families are going in and coming out of the glass-wrapped building. I wonder how far we are from the nearest hospital.
Everybody out.
Lily, hurry, Mom says as she unbuckles her seatbelt and opens the door. I look over to Roger one last time and try to smile. He looks back at me. For a moment, there's the faintest glimmer of recognition in his eyes. I think maybe he's going to shut the door and stay in the car. And then he sneers at me, and the moment is lost.
Stop staring at me, ass face!
Language, Roger.
Dad says in his tone that means he doesn't actually care. But he has to act like he does so Mom won't get mad. We all get out. Mom holds my hand as we cross the parking lot, even though I'm not a baby. I keep looking back at Roger and Dad and waiting for it to happen. Roger's going to die. I know it. I just don't know how. Maybe that big rock is going to come loose from its base and fall right on top of him, like a boot on an ant. I've stepped on ants before. I always say sorry afterward, but it's kind of pointless by then. I wonder if his insides will squish out like they do on ants. The rock does not squish Roger. My mom takes me into the women's restroom where we do our business. The toilets are those ones that flush automatically. They always scare me. Like, I think the one I'm on won't detect that I'm on it anymore and flush and I'll get sucked in. I go, but the whole time I'm waiting to hear the shouts and cries from outside. Maybe Roger gets sucked into the automatic toilet. My mom has a word for something like that. Apropops. Roger does not get sucked into the automatic toilets. We meet out in the lobby area where they have an information kiosk and little cubby holes filled with sightseeing maps and brochures for hotels and water parks. I want to look at the one about an outdoor animal safari zoo, but Dad is in a hurry to get back on the road, so Mom drags me back out to the parking lot. We pile into the station wagon with empty bladders. I'm feeling a bit confused, because Roger is still alive, and it's been at least 10 minutes since I knew he was going to die. I don't say anything on the matter because Mom and Dad don't like it when I talk about my premonitions, as they call them. Also, I'd rather not jinx it if I'm actually wrong for once. Roger's kinda mean, but he's my brother and I love him. I hug Pasher and stare out the window as we pull out of our parking space. Suddenly, Pasher is snatched from my arms. I turn, startled, to see Roger holding the doll out of his window, waving it in his hand. He grins at me.
Hey, assface, wanna see if your dolly can fly?
I realize this is the moment. I can't help but say something. This is when you die, I tell him solemnly. Roger's smirk is replaced by one of anger. He lets go of Pasher, who disappears beneath the wheels of our car. In my distress, I cry out, lurching against my seatbelt as if I can whisk out the window and snatch Pasher up before he's lost forever. Mom turns and starts asking loudly what just happened. Dad turns to yell at us to stop it. Lily, stop screaming. Roger, what did you do? Roger, what did you do? My father is looking in the rear-view mirror at what he considers his two biggest mistakes. My mother is passing her glare back and forth between me and Roger. Roger is looking at Mom and Dad and trying to put on an innocent expression as he lies and tells them that I started it. Only one of us is looking at the lane for the big trucks that we're currently merging with at Dad's typical high rate of speed. And that's me. What I see out Roger's window is a giant truck with lots of big tires and a large trailer on back barreling down at us with a driver in the cab who looks as shocked and confused as I am. I'm not screaming for Pasher anymore. I'm screaming for Dad to brake or steer or anything, but he can't tell the difference between one type of screaming and the next. And anyway, it's too late. Do you know what a T-bone is? I always thought it was a type of steak. My Uncle George ordered a T-bone once at a restaurant, and he got this mammoth piece of meat with the bone still in it. That's why they call it a T-bone. 'Cause the bone is there, and it looks like the letter T. Apparently, T-bone is also a type of collision where one vehicle strikes another in the side. Because the two vehicles make a T-shape, just like the bone in the steak my uncle ordered. That's what the big truck does to us. It T-bones us right before the on-ramp to the interstate. The nearest hospital is 23 minutes away. I would never have guessed that number. They take Roger and my dad there in an ambulance. Dad has a dislocated shoulder and a lot of cuts and bruising. Roger is airlifted to Boston Memorial. He gets to fly in a helicopter. Although, he isn't conscious for it, so he kinda misses out. He dies from internal injuries before he gets there. Mom and I are treated for lots of little cuts from glass and stuff. The driver of the truck is fine, but shook up by the whole thing. I hope he doesn't blame himself for Roger's death. That was nobody's fault but Roger. One of the emergency medical people who treats us on the scene finds Pasher and gives him back to me. He always finds his way back to me. The EMT asks me what my doll's name is and gives me a funny look when I tell him. I don't tell him that he's about to get a call for an old lady who suffered a stroke in some place called Middlebury. That kind of trivial information is lost on most people. Kind of like I know my mom and dad are going to cry and hug each other and worry about Roger until they find out he's dead. After that, Dad will be more distant because he secretly blames me. It's not a secret, Dad. I know. And Mom will hug me a little tighter each night at bedtime. I see it. But they don't need to know I do. I hope Roger is in a better place. But Pasher tells me he's not. Pasher is always right. My name is Lily Madwhip, and I don't need a therapist. Do you think Roger is with God, Lily? That's my therapist. Her name is Miss Christie. She's about my mom's age, but uses less makeup, probably because she doesn't have any kids of her own. Miss Christie wears a little chain around her neck with a cross on it. She also wears a jacket with too many buttons and not enough holes. I wonder what all those extra buttons are for. She always wears the same jacket. Does she have only the one, or does she have lots of jackets that all look the same? I'm never going to know the answer to these urgent mysteries. Ever since Roger died, I have to sit in this room twice a week with shelves full of books about child psychology and drawings by other kids on the walls and talk to Miss Christie. I guess Mom and Dad thought I wasn't handling Roger's death appropriately. Well, Mom didn't, anyway. Dad doesn't really talk to either of us much anymore. Mom is out in the waiting area with Pasher. I'm not allowed to bring Pasher in with me when I talk to Miss Christie. Other kids get to bring things in. There's this girl with black hair who always shows up with a teddy bear that chuckles whenever she squeezes it. And one kid even brings in a toy fire engine with flashing lights, and flashing lights can cause seizures. I don't think Miss Christie likes Pasher. Sure, I shrug. Roger's in heaven. Roger isn't in heaven. He's not in hell either. Roger's not in some underground cave filled with red demons carrying pitchforks that stab him as red flames shoot out of the rocks. He's not sitting on a cloud with a harp either. I think he'd be pretty annoyed if someone handed him a harp. He'd probably throw it at them and then call them an ass face. Roger's on the other side of town, in a place called Holy Oak Cemetery, where Mom and Dad paid for a plot in the back by a willow tree, in a creepy stone crypt with an angel on top that looks nothing like a real angel. They got a little polished stone marker to put on his grave that just says Roger T. Madwhip in all caps and Beloved Son in cursive underneath. And that's where Roger is. There, in his dead body. In a suit he'd probably make a face at if you told him he had to wear it in a coffin with white padding. I suppose in case he gets uncomfortable laying in the dark 6 feet underground with dirt and worms on top of it all. Pasher says Roger is in purgatory, which I guess means laying in your dead body until they decide what to do with you. Did you know there's over 200 bones in most people? When one gets broken, like if a man in a mask strikes you on the arm with like a crowbar, the body knows how to repair it over time. Unless the body is dead, then they just stay broken forever, I guess. Roger ended up with a lot of broken bones. Some of them were broken more than once, too. It was like a dozen guys in masks with crowbars just pounded on him for an hour or something. And now he's stuck in his coffin with that suit he hates and a whole bunch of broken bones that are never going to heal. I wonder, when they decide where he's going, if he's going to pop out all floppy like a jellyfish. The idea of Roger like a squishy sack makes me laugh. Oh. Miss Christie jots this down. I go stand by the window overlooking the parking lot. It's cold and wet outside today. There's a slick spot on the sidewalk into the building where Miss Christie works that I can see from her office. A lady and her son are walking in from their car. The boy is probably a couple years younger than me and wearing a pair of brown corduroy pants. He's going to slip on the slick spot, get those pants wet, and end up crying. But there's nothing I can do about it, so I look away. I hear the commotion from outside a moment later. It didn't rain when we buried Roger. I thought it was always supposed to rain when there's a funeral. I even dreamed that it rained, but the rain was lots of little bits of glass, and it was cutting everybody. Roger's friends Skeeter and Dustin were there in their suits and their hair combed, and they were crying because the glass was cutting them, and everybody was covered in blood. Mom said if it rained every time there was a funeral, it would never stop raining. That sounds like there are a lot of funerals going on. Do you miss him? Miss Christie asks. Yeah. Roger hid my foil Charizard before he died, and now I don't know where it is. Uncle George gave it to me for my birthday when I turned 5 because he was getting rid of my cousin Susie's old collection, and he said if I hung on to it, I could probably use it to pay for college someday. Susie was a year younger than Roger. She died in a boating accident one summer during a family reunion. When people hear boating accident, they think you were in a boat and there was an accident, like maybe you hit another boat or ended up out of the water. But Susie was in the water, and the boat ran her over. So I think it was more of a swimming accident that just happened to involve a boat. I was there when it happened, but that's a whole other story. Ever since, I don't like going in the water. Not as long as there's still boats, and sharks, and piranhas. Do you ever feel like crying? Miss Christie asks. She dyes her hair. She doesn't think anyone knows, but I know. I suppose if I really wanted to blow her mind, I could ask Pasha where she gets it done and what the person's name is who does it for her. Maybe then people will stop treating me like I'm making things up. Or no, Maybe they'll want to cut open my brain. Roger said they would do that if they thought I really did see things before they happen. But Roger's dead now. I don't want them cutting open my brain, so I don't tell Miss Christie I know her hair color is fake. I already cried, I say instead. I did cry, but only because other people expected it of me, especially at a funeral. I just want to get back to school and see my friends. I don't have any friends at school. I used to have a friend named Rachel, but I warned her that her dog Ruffy was going to have seizures and die, and she stopped being my friend. Other kids think I'm weird. Jeffrey Baker calls me Mad Lily. And that's okay because Pasher says puberty isn't going to be kind to Jeffrey. If I really wanted to be mean, I could tell everybody that he still wets the bed sometimes, but Pasher tells me not to be mean. Being mean lands you in purgatory. Miss Christie writes something in her notebook about me. I think it says that I'm uncooperative and repressing my emotions. I'm trying to be cooperative. But adults don't want to hear the truth. They want to hear what you say, what they think is right. And if you say something else, they think it's wrong, and then you have to start all over again. Sometimes they put you on drugs so they can tweak the chemicals in your brain until you think things you wouldn't otherwise. Like how much you miss your brother who used to give you wedgies and hid your foil Charizard before he died, and now you'll never go to college. Miss Christie? Please, call me Christie. Miss Christie, can I please bring Pasher in the next session? I ask. She gives me that face adults make where they know that you know the answer and are hoping you'll take the question back before they have to give it. I think Pasher should stay in the waiting room. Why? Because I want to hear from you, not Pasher. She doesn't really want to hear from me, because I would want to talk about why I'm suddenly seeing her lying motionless on the floor of some room with green carpeting and yellow furniture that came from IKEA. Her face is purple, and her tongue is sticking out, and it's all swelled up like the one I saw on a frog at the museum once. The frog was dead, too. The world is decorated with dead things. I want to ask if she feels dizzy or lightheaded, and if she had enough to eat at lunch. I wonder if IKEA is an acronym. Kind of like the one I see on the wristband they'll give her at the hospital. DNR.
She thinks you're schizo, ass face.
Roger says in my head.
She thinks you think your doll talks to you.
I don't feel safe without Pasher. When I see things before they happen like this, often Pasher can explain them to me. I don't know why he came to be with me. Maybe because in all the worlds, I'm the only person that bothered to name their doll Pasher. Maybe he knew I could see things before they happen and came to keep me company, and by a crazy coincidence, I gave the doll the same name as him. All I know is, he says he's an angel and not to be afraid, and that always makes me feel better. The time session finally runs out, and Miss Christie escorts me to the waiting room where Mom and Pasher are sitting with the other parents with their kids. My mom is talking to the mother of the boy who fell on the slick spot outside. He's sitting beside her with teary eyes and a long snot coming out of his nose. Gross. Miss Christie takes Mom aside, and they have a conversation in whispers. So I take Pasher aside and also have a conversation in whispers. Two can play at that game. I know Miss Christie's telling my mother about emotional repression, and my mother is asking Miss Christie about pharmaceutical solutions. My mother likes pharmaceutical solutions. I ask Pasher what DNR stands for. Then I have to ask him what resuscitate means. Sounds like I'm not going to be seeing Miss Christie anymore. I want to warn her, but I don't know what to warn her about. Is it a bad fall? Does she have a heart attack? She looks healthy enough. I wish I got a fuller picture when I see things before they happen. But then, does it even matter? Nobody ever listens to me. Mom wants me to stop making things up to explain the bad stuff that seems to always happen around me. And Dad already thinks I'm cursed and causing these things to happen. They sleep in separate beds now. And Dad spends a lot of time out in the garage drinking and banging on Roger's drum set. I wonder if Miss Christie will go to purgatory like Roger. Miss Christie turns to me and flashes her fake smile. See you next Tuesday, okay, Lily? I fake smile back at her, shaking my head sadly. Okay. Maybe I am cursed, but I don't need a therapist.
Hey there kids, it's me, MrCreepyPasta, and once again, it's the end of tonight's video, so I want to tell you all thank you for listening or watching however you hear my voice. Whether it be on YouTube or on the podcast, thank you so much for being here with me. There's going to be a new story every Tuesday, Thursday, Saturday, and Sunday night right here on YouTube, or if you're not watching on YouTube, that means the podcast gets updated on SoundCloud, Apple, Google Play, and now the podcast is on Spotify. So if it's easier for you guys to listen there than it is to listen on YouTube, then hey, not such a bad deal, right? As always, any support you guys give towards MrCreepyPasta Storytime really does help me out. I can actually keep the lights on in the house, and I can get nice little cat treats for Hercules. Okay, sorry for taking up so much of your time. Thank you guys for listening once again, and sweet dreams.